Sand. Part 1. 1. As Felix Henriette came through the streets that January night, the fog was stifling. But when he reached his little flat upon the top floor, there came a sound of wind. Wind was stirring about the world. It blew against his windows, but at first so faintly that he hardly noticed it. Then, with an abrupt rise and fall like a wailing voice that sought to claim attention, it called him. He peered through the window into the blurred darkness, listening. There is no cry in the world like that of the homeless wind. A vague excitement, scarcely to be analyzed, ran through his blood. The curtain of fog waved momentarily aside. Henriette fancied a star peeped down at him. "It will change things a bit, at last," he sighed, settling back into his chair. "It will bring movement." Already something in himself had changed. A restlessness as of that wandering wind woke in his heart, the desire to be off and away. Other things could rouse this wildness too. Falling water, the singing of a bird, an odor of wood fire, a glimpse of winding road. But the cry of wind, always searching, questioning, traveling the world's great routes, remained ever the master touch. High longing took his mood in hand. Mid 7 millions he felt suddenly lonely. "I will arise and go now, for always night and day I hear lake water lapping with low sounds by the shore, while I stand on the roadway or on the pavement's gray. I hear it in the deep heart's core." He murmured the words over softly to himself. The emotion that produced Innisfree passed strongly through him. He too would be over the hills and far away. He craved movement, change, adventure. Somewhere far from shops and crowds and motor buses. For a week the fog had stifled London. This wind brought life. Where should he go? Desire was long, his purse was short. He glanced at his books, letters, newspapers. They had no interest now. Instead he listened. The panorama of other journeys rolled in color through the little room, flying on one another's heels. Henriette enjoyed this remembered essence of his travels more than the travels themselves. The crying wind brought so many voices, all of them seductive. There was a soft crashing of waves upon the black seashores, where the huge Caucasus beckoned in the sky beyond, a rustling in the umbrella pines and cactus at Marseille, whence magic steamers start about the world like flying dreams. He heard the plash of fountains upon Mount Ida's slopes, and the whisper of tamarisk on Marathon. It was dawn once more upon the Ionian Sea, and he smelt the perfume of the Cyclades. Blue-veiled islands melted in the sunshine, and across the dewy lawns of Tempe, moistened by the spray of many waterfalls, he saw, great heavens above, the dancing of white forms. Or was it only mist the sunshine painted against Pelion? Methought among the lawns together we wandered underneath the young grey dawn, and multitudes of dense white fleecy clouds shepherded by the slow unwilling wind. And then into his stuffy room slipped the singing perfume of a wallflower on a ruined tower, and with it the sweetness of hot ivy. He heard the yellow bees in the ivy bloom. Wind whipped over the open hills, this very wind that labored drearily through the London fog. And he was caught. The darkness melted from the city. The fog whisked off into an azure sky. The roar of traffic turned into booming of the sea. There was a whistling among cordage, and the floor swayed to and fro. He saw a sailor touch his cap and pocket the 2 franc piece. The siren hooted, ominous sound that had started him on many a journey of adventure, and the roar of London became mere insignificant clatter of a child's toy carriages. He loved that siren's call. There was something deep and pitiless in it. It drew the wanderers forth from cities everywhere. "Leave your world behind you and come with me, for better or for worse. The anchor is up. It is too late to change. Only, beware, you shall know curious things, and alone." Henriette stirred uneasily in his chair. He turned with sudden energy to the shelf of guidebooks, maps, and timetables, possessions he most valued in the whole room. He was a happy-go-lucky, adventure-loving soul, careless of common standards, athirst ever for the new and strange. That's the best of having a cheap flat, he laughed, and no ties in the world. I can turn the key and disappear. No one cares or knows. No one but the thieving caretaker, and he has long ago found out there's nothing worth taking. There followed then no lengthy indecision. Preparation was even shorter still. He was always ready for a move, and his sojourn in cities was but breathing space while he gathered pennies for further wanderings. An enormous kit bag, sack-shaped, very worn and dirty, emerged speedily from the bottom of a cupboard in the wall. It was of limitless capacity. The key and padlock rattled in its depths. Cigarette ashes covered everything while he stuffed it full of ancient, indescribable garments. And his voice, singing of those yellow bees in the ivy bloom, mingled with the cry of the rising wind about his windows. His restlessness had disappeared by magic. This time, however, there could be no haunted Pelion, nor shady groves of Timp, for he lived in sophisticated times when money markets regulated movement sternly. Traveling was only for the rich. Mere wanderers must pick it. He remembered instead an opportune invitation to the desert. Objective invitation, his genial hosts had called it, knowing his hatred of convention. And Helouan danced into letters of brilliance upon the inner map of his mind. For Egypt had ever held his spirit in thrall, though as yet he had tried in vain to touch the great buried soul of her. The excavators, the Egyptologists, the archaeologists, most of all, plastered her gray ancient face with labels like hotel advertisements on travelers' portmanteaux. They told where she had come from last, but nothing of what she dreamed and thought and loved. The heart of Egypt lay beneath the sand, and the trifling robbery of little details that poked forth from tombs and temples brought no true revelation of her stupendous spiritual splendor. Henriette, in his youth, had searched and dived among what material he could find, believing once, or half-believing, that the ceremonial of that ancient system veiled a weight of symbol that was reflected from genuine suprasensual knowledge. The rituals, now taken literally and so pityingly explained away, had once been genuine pathways of approach. But never yet, and least of all in his previous visits to Egypt itself, had he discovered one single person worthy of speech who caught at his idea. Curious, they said, then turned away to go on digging in the sand. Sand smothered her world today. Excavators discovered skeletons. Museums everywhere stored them, grinning, literal relics that told nothing. But now, while he packed and sang, these hopes of enthusiastic younger days stirred again, because the emotion that gave them birth was real and true in him. Through the morning mists upon the Nile, an old pyramid bowed hugely at him across London roofs. "Come," he heard its awful whisper beneath the ceiling. "I have things to show you, and to tell." He saw the flock of them sailing the desert like weird gray solemn ships that make no earthly port. And he imagined them as one, multiple expressions of some single unearthly portent they adumbrated in mighty form, dead symbols of some spiritual conception long vanished from the world. "I mustn't dream like this," he laughed, "or I shall get absent-minded and pack fire tongs instead of boots. It looks like a jumble sale already." And he stood on a heap of things to wedge them down still tighter. But the pictures would not cease. He saw the kites circling high in the blue air. A couple of white vultures flapped lazily away over shining miles. Felucca sails, like giant wings emerging from the ground, curved toward him from the Nile. The palm trees dropped long shadows over Memphis. He felt the delicious drenching heat, and the Kamasin, that overwind from Nubia, brushed his very cheeks. In the little gardens the mishmish was in bloom. He smelt the desert, gray sepulchre of cancelled cycles. The stillness of her interminable reaches dropped down upon old London. The magic of the sand stole round him in its silent-footed tempest. And while he struggled with that strange capacious sack, the piles of clothing ran into shapes of gleaming Bedouin faces. London garments settled down with the mournful sound of camels' feet, half-dropping wind, half water flowing underground, sound that old time had brought over into modern life and left a moment for our wonder and perhaps our tears. He rose at length with the excitement of some deep enchantment in his eyes. The thought of Egypt plunged ever so deeply into him, carrying him into depths where he found it difficult to breathe, so strangely far away it seemed, yet indefinably familiar. He lost his way. A touch of fear came with it. "A sack like that is the wonder of the world," he laughed again, kicking the unwieldy sausage-shaped monster into a corner of the room and sitting down to write the thrilling labels, Felix Henriette, Alexandria via Marseille. But his pen blotted the letters. There was sand in it. He rewrote the words. Then he remembered a dozen things he had left out. Impatiently, yet with confusion somewhere, he stuffed them in. They ran away into shifting heaps. They disappeared. They emerged suddenly again. It was like packing hot, dry, flowing sand. From the pockets of a coat, he had worn it last summer down Dorset way, out trickled sand. There was sand in his mind and thoughts. And his dreams that night were full of winds, the old sad winds of Egypt and of moving, sifting sand. Arabs and Afrits danced amazingly together across dunes he could never reach, for he could not follow fast enough. Something infinitely older than these ever caught his feet and held him back. A million tiny fingers stung and pricked him. Something flung a veil before his eyes. Once it touched him, his face and hands and neck. "Stay here with us," he heard a host of muffled voices crying, but their sound was smothered, buried, rising through the ground. A myriad throats were choked, till at last, with a violent effort, he turned and seized it. And then the thing he grasped at slipped between his fingers and ran easily away. It had a gray and yellow face, and it moved through all its parts. It flowed as water flows, and yet was solid. It was centuries old. He cried out to it. "Who are you? What is your name? I surely know you, but I have forgotten." And it stopped, turning from far away its great uncovered countenance of nameless coloring. He caught a voice. It rolled and boomed and whispered like the wind, and then he woke with a curious shaking in his heart, and a little touch of chilly perspiration on the skin. But the voice seemed in the room still, close beside him. "I am the sand," he heard before it died away. And next he realized that the glitter of Paris lay behind him, and a steamer was taking him with much unnecessary motion across a sparkling sea towards Alexandria. Gladly he saw the Riviera fade below the horizon, with its hard, bright sunshine, treacherous winds, and its smear of rich, conventional English. All restlessness now had left him. True vagabond still at 40, he only felt the unrest and discomfort of life when caught in the network of routine and rigid streets. No chance of breaking loose. He was off again at last. Money scarce enough indeed, but the joy of wandering expressing itself in happy emotions of release. Every warning of calculation was stifled. He thought of the American woman who walked out of her Long Island house one summer's day to look at a passing sail, and was gone 8 years before she walked in again. 8 years of roving travel. He had always felt respect and admiration for that woman. For Felix Henriette, with his admixture of foreign blood, was philosopher as well as vagabond, a strong poetic and religious strain sometimes breaking out through fissures in his complex nature. He had seen much life, had read many books. The passionate desire of youth to solve the world's big riddles had given place to a resignation filled to the brim with wonder. Anything might be true. Nothing surprised him. The most outlandish beliefs, for all he knew, might fringe truth somewhere. He had escaped that cheap cynicism with which disappointed men soothe their vanity when they realize that an intelligible explanation of the universe lies beyond their powers. He no longer expected final answers. For him, even the smallest journeys held the spice of some adventure, and they shaped for themselves somehow a dramatic form. "It's like a story," his friend said when he told his travels. It always was a story. But the adventure that lay waiting for him where the silent streets of Little Helouan kissed the great desert's lips was of a different kind to any Henriette had yet encountered. Looking back, he has often asked himself, how in the world can I accept it? And perhaps he never yet has accepted it. It was sand that brought it. For the desert, the stupendous thing that mothers little Helouan, produced it. 2. He slipped through Cairo with the same relief that he left the Riviera, resenting its social vulgarities so close to the imperial aristocracy of the desert. He settled down into the peace of soft and silent little Helouan. The hotel into which he had a room on the top floor had been formerly a Khedivial palace. It had the air of a palace still. He felt himself in a country house, with lofty ceilings, cool and airy corridors, spacious halls. Soft-footed Arabs attended to his wants. White walls let in light and air without a sign of heat. There was a feeling of a large spread tent pitched on the very sand, and the wind that stirred the oleanders in the shady gardens also crept in to rustle the palm leaves of his favorite corner seat. Through the large windows where once the Khedive held high court, the sunshine blazed upon vistaed leagues of desert. And from his bedroom windows he watched the sun dip into gold and crimson behind the swelling Libyan sands. This side of the pyramids he saw the Nile meander among palm groves and tilled fields. Across his balcony railings the Egyptian stars trooped down beside his very bed, shaping old constellations for his dreams, while to the south he looked out upon the vast, untamable body of the sands that carpeted the world for thousands of miles towards Upper Egypt, Nubia, and the dread Sahara itself. He wondered again why people thought it necessary to go so far afield to know the desert. Here, within half an hour of Cairo, it lay breathing solemnly at his very doors. For little Helouan, caught thus between the shoulders of the Libyan and Arabian deserts, is utterly sand-haunted. The desert lies all around it like a sea. Henriette felt he never could escape from it, as he moved about the island whose coasts are washed with sand. Down each broad and shining street the two end houses framed a vista of its dim immensity. Glimpses of shimmering blue or flame-touched purple. There were stretches of deep sea green as well, far off upon its bosom. The streets were open channels of approach, and the eye ran down them as along the tube of a telescope, laid to catch incredible distance out of space. Through them the desert reached in with long, thin feelers towards the village. Its being flooded into Helouan and over it. Past walls and houses, churches and hotels, the sea of desert pressed in silently with its myriad soft feet of sand. It poured in everywhere, through crack and slit and cranny. These were reminders of possession and ownership. And every passing wind that lifted eddies of dust at the street corners were messages from the quiet, powerful thing that permitted Helouan to lie and dream so peacefully in the sunshine. Mere artificial oasis, its existence was temporary, held on lease just for 99 centuries or so. This sea idea became insistent, for in certain lights, and especially in the brief, bewildering dusk, the desert rose, swaying towards the small white houses. The waves of it ran for 50 miles without a break. It was too deep for foam or surface agitation, yet it knew the swell of tides. And underneath flowed resolute currents, linking distance to the center. These many deserts were really one. A storm, just retreated, had tossed Helouan upon the shore and left it there to dry. But any morning he would wake to find it had been carried off again into the depths. Some fragment at least would disappear. The grim Mokattam hills were rollers that ever threatened to topple down and submerge the sandy bar that men called Helouan. Being soundless and devoid of perfume, the desert's message reached him through two senses only, sight and touch. Chiefly, of course, the former. Its invasion was concentrated through the eyes, and vision, thus uncorrected, went what pace it pleased. The desert played with him. Sand stole into his being through the eyes. And so obsessing was this majesty of its close presence that Henriette sometimes wondered how people dared their little social activities within its very sight and hearing, how they played golf and tennis upon reclaimed edges of its face, picnicked so blithely hard upon its frontiers, and danced at night while this stern, unfathomable thing lay breathing just beyond the trumpery walls that kept it out. The challenge of their shallow admiration seemed presumptuous, almost provocative. Their pursuit of pleasure suggested insolent indifference. They ran foolhardy hazards, he felt, for there was no worship in their vulgar hearts. With a mental shudder, sometimes he watched the cheap tourist horde go laughing, chattering past within view of its ancient, half-closed eyes. It was like defying deity. For, to his stirred imagination, the sublimity of the desert dwarfed humanity. These people had been wiser to choose another place for the flaunting of their tawdry insignificance. Any minute this wilderness, huddled in gray annihilation, might awake and notice them. In his own hotel were several smart, so-called society people, who emphasized the protest in him to the point of definite contempt. Overdressed, the latest worldly novel under their arms, they strutted the narrow pavements of their tiny world, immensely pleased with themselves. Their vacuous minds expressed themselves in the slang of their exclusive circle, value being the element excluded. The pettiness of their outlook hardly distressed him. He was too familiar with it at home. But their essential vulgarity, their innate ugliness, seemed more than usually offensive in the grandeur of its present setting. Into the mighty sands they took the latest London scandal, gabbling it over even among the tombs and temples. And it was to laugh, the pains they spent wondering whom they might condescend to know, never dreaming that they themselves were not worth knowing. Against the backdrop of the noble desert, their titles seemed the cap and bells of clowns. And Henriette, knowing some of them personally, could not always escape their insipid company. Yet he was the gainer. They little guessed how their commonness heightened contrast, set mercilessly thus beside the strange eternal beauty of the sand. Occasionally the protest in his soul betrayed itself in words, which of course they did not understand. "He is so clever, isn't he?" And then, having relieved his feelings, he would comfort himself characteristically. "The desert has not noticed them. The sand is not aware of their existence. How should the sea take note of rubbish that lies above its tide line?" For Henriette drew near to its great shifting altars in an attitude of worship. The wilderness made him kneel in heart. Its shining reaches led to the oldest temple in the world, and every journey that he made was like a sacrament. For him the desert was a consecrated place. It was sacred. And his tactful hosts, knowing his peculiarities, left their house open to him when he cared to come. They lived upon the northern edge of the oasis, and he was as free as though he were absolutely alone. He blessed them. He rejoiced that he had come. Little Heloise accepted him. The desert knew that he was there. From his corner of the big dining room he could see the other guests, but his roving eye always returned to the figure of a solitary man who sat at an adjoining table, and whose personality stirred his interest. While affecting to look elsewhere, he studied him as closely as might be. There was something about the stranger that touched his curiosity, a certain air of expectation that he wore. But it was more than that. It was anticipation, apprehension in it somewhere. The man was nervous, uneasy. His restless way of suddenly looking about him proved it. Henriette tried every one else in the room as well, but though his thought settled on others too, he always came back to the figure of this solitary being opposite, who ate his dinner as if afraid of being seen, and glanced up sometimes as if fearful of being watched. Henriette's curiosity, before he knew it, became suspicion. There was mystery here. The table, he noticed, was laid for two. Is he an actor? A priest of some strange religion? An inquiry agent? Or just a crank? Was the thought that first occurred to him. And the question suggested itself without amusement. The impression of subterfuge and caution he conveyed left his observer unsatisfied. The face was clean-shaven, dark and strong. Thick hair, straight yet bushy, was slightly unkempt. It was streaked with gray, and an unexpected mobility when he smiled ran over the features that he seemed to hold rigid by deliberate effort. The man was cut to no quite common measure. Henriette jumped to an intuitive conclusion. He's not here for pleasure or merely sightseeing. Something serious has brought him out to Egypt. For the face combined two ill-assorted qualities. An obstinate tenacity that might even mean brutality, and was certainly repulsive, yet with it an undecipherable dreaminess betrayed by lines of the mouth, but above all in the very light blue eyes, so rarely raised. Those eyes, he felt, had looked upon unusual things. Dreaminess was not an adequate description. Searching conveyed it better. The true source of the queer impression remained elusive, and hence, perhaps, the incongruous marriage in the face, mobility laid upon a matter-of-fact foundation underneath. The face showed conflict. And Henriette, watching him, felt decidedly intrigued. I'd like to know that man, and all about him. His name, he learned later, was Richard Vance, from Birmingham, a businessman. But it was not the Birmingham he wished to know. It was the other, cause of the elusive, dreamy searching. Though facing one another at so short a distance, their eyes, however, did not meet. And this, Henriette well knew, was a sure sign that he himself was also under observation. Richard Vance from Birmingham was equally taking careful note of Felix Henriette from London. Thus he could wait his time. They would come together later. An opportunity would certainly present itself. The first links in a curious chain had already caught. Soon the chain would tighten, pull as though by chance, and bring their lives into one and the same circle. Wondering in particular for what kind of a companion the second cover was laid, Henriette felt certain that their eventual coming together was inevitable. He possessed this kind of divination from first impressions, and not uncommonly it proved correct. Following instinct, therefore, he took no steps toward acquaintance, and for several days, owing to the fact that he dined frequently with his hosts, he saw nothing more of Richard Vance, the businessman from Birmingham. Then one night, coming home late from his friend's house, he had passed along the great corridor, and was actually a step or so into his bedroom when a drawling voice sounded close behind him. It was an unpleasant sound. It was very near him, too. "I beg your pardon, but have you by any chance such a thing as a compass you could lend me?" The voice was so close that he started. Vance stood within touching distance of his body. He had stolen up like a ghostly Arab, must have followed him, too, some little distance, for further down the passage the light of an open door, he had passed it on his way, showed where he came from. I beg your pardon, compass, did you say? He felt disconcerted for a moment. How short the man was, now that he saw him standing. Broad and powerful, too. Henriette looked down upon his thick head of hair. The personality and voice repelled him. Possibly his face, caught unawares, betrayed this. "Forgive my startling you," said the other apologetically, while the softer expression danced in for a moment and disorganized the rigid set of the face. "The soft carpet, you know. I'm afraid you didn't hear my tread. I wondered." He smiled again slightly at the nature of the request. "If, by any chance, you had a pocket compass you could lend me." Compass, yes. Please don't apologize. I believe I have one, if you'll wait a moment. Come in, won't you? I'll have a look." The other thanked him, but waited in the passage. Henriette, it so happened, had a compass, and produced it after a moment's search. "I am greatly indebted to you. If I may return it in the morning, you will forgive my disturbing you at such an hour. My own is broken, and I wanted to find the true north." Henriette stammered some reply, and the man was gone. It was all over in a minute. He locked his door and sat down in his chair to think. The little incident had upset him, though for the life of him he could not imagine why. It ought by rights to have been almost ludicrous, yet instead it was the exact reverse, half threatening. But why should not a man want a compass? But again, why should he? And at midnight? The voice, the eyes, the near presence, what did they bring that set his nerves thus asking unusual questions? This strange impression that something grave was happening, something unearthly. How was it born exactly? The man's proximity came like a shock. It had made him start. He brought, thus the idea came unbidden to his mind, something with him that galvanized him quite absurdly, as fear does, or delight, or great wonder. There was a music in his voice, too, a certain Well, he could only call it lilt that reminded him of plain-song intoning chanting. Drawling was not the word at all. He tried to dismiss it as imagination, but it would not be dismissed. The disturbance in him was caused by something not imaginary, but real. And then for the first time he discovered that the man had brought a faint, elusive suggestion of perfume with him, an aromatic odor that made him think of priests and churches. The ghost of it still lingered in the air. Ah, here was then the origin of the notion that his voice had chanted. It was surely the suggestion of incense. But incense, intoning, a compass to find the true north, at midnight, in a desert hotel? A touch of uneasiness ran through the curiosity and excitement that he felt, and he undressed for bed. Confound my old imagination, he thought. What tricks it plays me. It'll keep me awake. But the questions, once started in his mind, continued. He must find explanation of one kind or another before he could lie down and sleep, and he found it at length in the stars. The man was an astronomer of sorts, possibly an astrologer into the bargain. Why not? The stars were wonderful above Heloan. Was there not an observatory on the Makatam Hills, too, where tourists could use the telescopes on privileged days? He had it at last. He even stole out onto his balcony to see if the stranger perhaps was looking through some wonderful apparatus at the heavens. Their rooms were on the same side, but the shuttered windows revealed no stooping figure with eyes glued to a telescope. The stars blinked in their many thousands down upon the silent desert. The night held neither sound nor movement. There was a cool breeze blowing across the Nile from the Libyan sands. It nipped, and he stepped back quickly into the room again. Drawing the mosquito curtains carefully about the bed, he put the light out and turned over to sleep. And sleep came quickly, contrary to his expectations, though it was a light and surface sleep. That last glimpse of the darkened desert lying beneath the Egyptian stars had touched him with some hand of awful power that ousted the first, lesser excitement. It calmed and soothed him in one sense, yet, in another, a sense he could not understand, it caught him in a net of deep, deep feelings, whose mesh, while infinitely delicate, was utterly stupendous. His nerves this deeper emotion left alone. It reached instead to something infinite in him that mere nerves could neither deal with nor interpret. The soul awoke and whispered in him while his body slept. And the little foolish dreams that ran to and fro across this veil of surface sleep brought oddly tangled pictures of things quite tiny, and at the same time of others that were mighty beyond words. With these two counters, nightmare played. They interwove. There was the figure of this dark-faced man with the compass, measuring the sky to find the true north, and there were hints of giant presences that hovered just outside some curious outline that he traced upon the ground, copied in some nightmare fashion from the heavens. The excitement caused by his visitor's singular request mingled with the profounder sensations his final look at the stars and desert stirred. The two were somehow interrelated. Some hours later, before this surface sleep passed into genuine slumber, Henriette woke, with an appalling feeling that the desert had come creeping into his room, and now stared down upon him where he lay in bed. The wind was crying audibly about the walls outside. A faint, sharp tapping came against the window panes. He sprang instantly out of bed, not yet awake enough to feel actual alarm, yet with the nightmare touch still close enough to cause a sort of feverish, loose bewilderment. He switched the lights on. A moment later he knew the meaning of that curious tapping, for the rising wind was flinging tiny specks of sand against the glass. The idea that they had summoned him belonged, of course, to dream. He opened the window and stepped out onto the balcony. The stone was very cold under his bare feet. There was a wash of wind all over him. He saw the sheet of glimmering pale desert near and far, and something stung his skin below the eyes. "The sand," he whispered. "Again the sand. Always the sand. Waking or sleeping, the sand is everywhere. Nothing but sand, sand, sand." He rubbed his eyes. It was like talking in his sleep, talking to someone who had questioned him just before he woke. But was he really properly awake? It seemed next day that he had dreamed it. Something enormous, with rustling skirts of sand, had just retreated far into the desert. Sand went with it, flowing, trailing, smothering the world. The wind died down, and Henriette went back to sleep, caught instantly away into unconsciousness, covered, blinded, swept over by this spreading thing of reddish-brown with the great gray face whose being was colossal yet quite tiny, and whose fingers, wings, and eyes were countless as the stars. But all night long it watched and waited, rising to peer above the little balcony, and sometimes entering the room and piling up beside his very pillow. He dreamed of sand. 3. For some days Henriette saw little of the man who came from Birmingham, and pushed curiosity to a climax by asking for a compass in the middle of the night. For one thing, he was a good deal with his friends upon the other side of Helouan, and for another, he slept several nights in the desert. He loved the gigantic peace the desert gave him. The world was forgotten there, and not the world merely, but all memory of it. Everything faded out. The soul turned inwards upon itself. An Arab boy and donkey took out sleeping bag, food, and water to the Wadi Hof, a desolate gorge about an hour eastwards. It winds between cliffs whose summits rise some 1,000 feet above the sea. It opens suddenly, cut deep into the swaying world of level plateau and undulating hills. It moves about, too. He never found it in the same place twice, like an arm of the desert that shifted with the changing lights. Here he watched dawns and sunsets, slept through the midday heat, and enjoyed the unearthly coloring that swept day and night across the huge horizons. In solitude, the desert soaked down into him. At night, the jackals cried in the darkness round his cautiously fed campfire, small because wood had to be carried, and in the daytime kites circled overhead to inspect him, and an occasional white vulture flapped across the blue. The weird desolation of this rocky valley, he thought, was like the scenery of the moon. He took no watch with him, and the arrival of the donkey boy an hour after sunrise came almost from another planet, bringing thing of time and common life out of some distant gulf where they had lain forgotten among lost ages. The short hour of twilight brought, too, a bewitchment into the silence that was little less than comfortable. Full light or darkness he could manage, but this time of half-things made him want to shut his eyes and hide. Its effect stepped over imagination. The mind got lost. He could not understand it, for the cliffs and boulders of discolored limestone shone then with an inward glow that signaled to the desert with veiled lanterns. The misshapen hills, carved by wind and rain into ominous outlines, stirred and nodded. In the morning light they retired into themselves, asleep. But at dusk the tide retreated. They rose from the sea, emerging naked, threatening. They ran together and joined shoulders, the entire army of them. And the glow of their sandy bodies, self-luminous, continued even beneath the stars. Only the moonlight drowned it. For the moonrise over Makatum hills brought a white, grand loveliness that drenched the entire desert. It drew a marvelous sweetness from the sand. It shone across a world as yet unfinished, whereon no life might show itself for ages yet to come. He was alone then upon an empty star, before the creation of things that breathed and moved. What impressed him, however, more than everything else was the enormous vitality that rose out of all this apparent death. There was no hint of the melancholy that belongs commonly to flatness. The sadness of wide, monotonous landscape was not here. The endless repetition of sweeping vale and plateau brought infinity within measurable comprehension. He grasped a definite meaning in the phrase, world without end. The desert had no end and no beginning. It gave him a sense of eternal peace, the silent peace that starfields know. Instead of subduing the soul with bewilderment, it inspired with courage, confidence, hope. Through this sand, which was the wreck of countless geological ages, rushed life that was terrific and uplifting, too huge to include melancholy, too deep to betray itself in movement. Here was the stillness of eternity. Behind the spread gray mask of apparent death lay stores of accumulated life, ready to break forth at any point. In the desert he felt himself absolutely royal. And this contrast of life, veiling itself in death, was a contradiction that somehow intoxicated. The desert exhilaration never left him. He was never alone. A companionship of millions went with him, and he felt the desert close, as stars are close to one another or grains of sand. It was the Kamasan, the hot wind bringing sand, that drove him in. With the feeling that these few days and nights had been immeasurable, and that he had been away 1,000 years. He came back with the magic of the desert in his blood, hotel life tasteless and insipid by comparison. To human impressions, thus, he was fresh and vividly sensitive. His being, clean and sensitized by pure grandeur, felt people, for a time at any rate, with an uncommon sharpness of receptive judgment. He returned to a life somehow mean and meager, resuming insignificance with his dinner jacket. Out with the sand he had been regal. Now, like a slave, he strutted self-conscious and reduced. But this imperial standard of the desert stayed a little time beside him, its purity focusing judgment like a lens. The specks of smaller emotions left it clear at first, and as his eye wandered vaguely over the people assembled in the dining room, it was arrested with a vivid shock upon two figures at the little table facing him. He had forgotten Vance, the Birmingham man who sought the north at midnight with a pocket compass. He now saw him again, with an intuitive discernment entirely fresh. Before memory brought up her clouding associations, some brilliance flashed a light upon him. That man, Henriette thought, might have come with me. He would have understood and loved it. But the thought was really this. A moment's reflection spread it, rather. He belongs somewhere to the desert. The desert brought him out here. And again, hidden swiftly behind it like a movement running below water. What does he want with it? What is the deeper motive he conceals? For there is a deeper motive, and it is concealed. But it was the woman seated next to him who absorbed his attention, really, even while this thought flashed and went its way. The empty chair was occupied at last. Unlike his first encounter with the man, she looked straight at him. Their eyes met fully. For several seconds there was steady mutual inspection, while her penetrating stare, intent without being rude, passed searchingly all over his face. It was disconcerting. Crumbling his bread, he looked equally hard at her, unable to turn away, determined not to be the first to shift his gaze. And when at length she lowered her eyes, he felt that many things had happened, as in a long period of intimate conversation. Her mind had judged him through and through. Questions and answer flashed. They were no longer strangers. For the rest of dinner, though he was careful to avoid direct inspection, he was aware that she felt his presence and was secretly speaking with him. She asked questions beneath her breath. The answers rose with the quickened pulses in his blood. Moreover, she explained Richard Vance. It was this woman's power that shone reflected in the man. She was the one who knew the big, unusual things. Vance merely echoed the rush of her vital personality. This was the first impression that he got, from the most striking, curious face he had ever seen in a woman. It remained very near him all through the meal. She had moved to his table. It seemed she sat beside him. Their minds certainly knew contact from that moment. It is never difficult to credit strangers with the qualities and knowledge that one's self craves for, and no doubt Henriette's active fancy went busily to work. But nonetheless this thing remained and grew, that this woman was aware of the hidden things of Egypt he had always longed to know. There was knowledge and guidance she could impart. Her soul was searching among ancient things. Her face brought the desert back into his thoughts, and with it came the sand. Here was the flash. The sight of her restored the peace and splendor he had left behind him in his desert camps. The rest, of course, was what his imagination constructed upon this slender basis, only not all of it was imagination. Now Henriette knew little enough of women and had no pose of understanding them. His experience was of the slightest. The love and veneration felt for his own mother had set the entire sex upon the heights. His affairs with women, if so they may be called, had been transient, all but those of early youth, which, having never known the devastating test of fulfillment, still remained ideal and superb. There was unconscious humor in his attitude, from a distance, for he regarded women with wonder and respect, as puzzles that sweetened but complicated life, might even endanger it. He certainly was not a marrying man. But now, as he felt the presence of this woman so deliberately possess him, there came over him two clear, strong messages, each vivid with certainty. One was that banal suggestion of familiarity claimed by lovers and the like. He had often heard of it. "I've known that woman before. I've met her ages ago somewhere. She is strangely familiar to me." And the other, growing out of it almost, "Have nothing to do with her. She will bring you trouble and confusion. Avoid her and be warned." In fact, a distinct presentiment. Yet, although Henriette dismissed both impressions as having no shred of evidence to justify them, the original clear judgment, as he studied her extraordinary countenance, persisted through all denials. The familiarity and the presentiment remained. There also remained this other, an enormous, imaginative leap, that she could teach him Egypt. He watched her carefully, in a sense fascinated. He could only describe the face as black, so dark it was with the darkness of great age. Elderly was the obvious natural word, but elderly described the features only. The expression of the face wore centuries. Nor was it merely the coal-black eyes that betrayed an ancient, age-traveled soul behind them. The entire presentment mysteriously conveyed it. This woman's heart knew long-forgotten things. The thought kept beating up against him. There were cheekbones, oddly high, that made him think involuntarily of the well-advertised pharaoh, Ramses, a square, deep jaw, and an aquiline nose that gave the final touch of power. For the power undeniably was there, and while the general effect had grimness in it, there was neither harshness nor any forbidding touch about it. There was an implacable sternness in the set of lips and jaw, and most curious of all, the eyelids over the steady eyes of black were level as a ruler. This level framing made the woman's stare remarkable beyond description. Henriette thought of an idol carved in stone, stone-hard and black, with eyes that stared across the sand into a world of things non-human, very far away, forgotten of men. The face was finely ugly. This strange dark beauty flashed flame about it. And, as the way ever was with him, Henriette next fell to constructing the possible lives of herself and her companion, though without much success. Imagination soon stopped dead. She was not old enough to be Vance's mother, and assuredly she was not his wife. His interest was more than merely piqued. It was puzzled uncommonly. What was the contrast that made the man seem beside her vile? Whence came, too, the impression that she exercised some strong authority, though never directly exercised, that held him at her mercy? How did he guess that the man resented it, yet did not dare oppose, and that, apparently acquiescing good-humoredly, his will was deliberately held in abeyance, and that he waited sulkily, biding his time? There was furtiveness in every gesture and expression. A hidden motive lurked in him, unworthiness somewhere. He was determined yet ashamed. He watched her ceaselessly, and with such uncanny closeness. Henriette imagined he divined all this. He leaped to the guess that his expenses were being paid. A good deal more was being paid besides. She was a rich relation from whom he had expectations. He was serving his 7 years, ashamed of his servitude, ever calculating escape, but perhaps no ordinary escape. A faint shudder ran over him. He drew in the reins of imagination. Of course the probabilities were that he was hopelessly astray. One usually is on such occasions. But this time it so happened he was singularly right. Before one thing only his ready invention stopped every time. This vileness, this notion of unworthiness in Vance, could not be negative merely. A man with that face was no inactive weakling. The motive he was at such pains to conceal, betraying its existence by that very fact, moved surely towards aggressive action. Disguised, it never slept. Vance was sharply on the alert. He had a plan deep out of sight, and Henriette remembered how the man's soft approach along the carpeted corridor had made him start. He recalled the quasi-shock it gave him. He thought again of the feeling of discomfort he had experienced. Next, his eager fancy sought to plumb the business these two had together in Egypt, in the desert. For the desert, he felt convinced, had brought them out. But here, though he constructed numerous explanations, another barrier stopped him, because he knew. This woman was in touch with that aspect of ancient Egypt he himself had ever sought in vain, and not merely with stones the sand had buried so deep, but with the meanings they once represented, buried so utterly by the sands of later thought. And here, being ignorant, he found no clue that could lead to any satisfactory result, for he possessed no knowledge that might guide him. He floundered until fate helped him. And the instant fate helped him, the warning and presentiment he had dismissed as fanciful became real again. He hesitated. Caution acted. He would think twice before taking steps to form acquaintance. Better not, thought whispered. Better leave them alone, this queer couple. They're after things that won't do you any good. This idea of mischief, almost of danger in their purposes, was oddly insistent, for what could possibly convey it? But while he hesitated, fate, who sent the warning, pushed him at the same time into the circle of their lives. At first tentatively, he might still have escaped, but soon urgently. Curiosity led him inexorably towards the end. Sand, Part 2. It was so simple a maneuver by which fate began the innocent game. The woman left a couple of books behind her on the table one night, and Henriette, after a moment's hesitation, took them out after her. He knew the titles, The House of the Master and The House of the Hidden Places, both singular interpretations of the pyramids that once had held his own mind spellbound. Their ideas had been since disproved, if he remembered rightly, yet the titles were a clue to that imaginative part of his mind that was so busy constructing theories and had found its stride. Loose sheets of paper covered with notes in a minute handwriting lay between the pages. But these, of course, he did not read, noticing only that they were written round designs of various kinds, intricate designs. He discovered Vance in a corner of the smoking lounge. The woman had disappeared. Vance thanked him politely. "My aunt is so forgetful sometimes," he said, and took them with a covert eagerness that did not escape the other's observation. He folded up the sheets and put them carefully in his pocket. On one there was an ink-sketched map, crammed with detail, that might well have referred to some portion of the desert. The points of the compass stood out boldly at the bottom. There were involved geometrical designs again. Henriette saw them. They exchanged then the commonplaces of conversation, but these led to nothing further. Vance was nervous and betrayed impatience. He presently excused himself and left the lounge. 10 minutes later he passed through the outer hall, the woman beside him, and the pair of them, wrapped up in cloak and ulster, went out into the night. At the door, Vance turned and threw a quick, investigating glance in his direction. There seemed a hint of questioning in that glance. It might almost have been a tentative invitation. But also he wanted to see if their exit had been particularly noticed, and by whom. This, briefly told, was the first maneuver by which fate introduced them. There was nothing in it. The details were so insignificant, so slight the conversation, so meager the pieces thus added to Henriette's imaginative structure. Yet they somehow built it up and made it solid. The outline in his mind began to stand foursquare. That writing, those designs, the manner of the man, their going out together, the final curious look, each and all betrayed points of a hidden thing. Subconsciously he was excavating their buried purposes. The sand was shifting. The concentration of his mind incessantly upon them removed it grain by grain and speck by speck. Tips of the smothered thing emerged. Presently a subsistence would follow with a rush, and light would blaze upon its skeleton. He felt it stirring underneath his feet, this flowing movement of light, dry, heaped-up sand. It was always sand. Then other incidents of a similar kind came about, clearing the way to a natural acquaintanceship. Henriette watched the process with amusement, yet with another feeling, too, that was only a little less than anxiety. A keen observer, no detail escaped him. He saw the forces of their lives drawn closer. It made him think of the devices of young people who desire to know one another, yet cannot get a proper introduction. Fate condescended to such little tricks. They wanted a third person, he began to feel. A third was necessary to some plan they had on hand, and they waited to see if he could fill the place. This woman, with whom he had yet exchanged no single word, seemed so familiar to him, well known for years. They weighed and watched him, wondering if he would do. None of the devices were too obviously used, but at length Henriette picked up so many forgotten articles and heard so many significant phrases casually let fall that he began to feel like the villain in a machine-made play, where the hero forever drops clues his enemy is intended to discover. Introduction followed inevitably. "My aunt can tell you. She knows Arabic perfectly." He had been discussing the meaning of some local name or other with a neighbor after dinner, and Vance had joined them. The neighbor moved away. These two were left standing alone, and he accepted a cigarette from the other's case. There was a rustle of skirts behind them. "Here she comes," said Vance. "You will let me introduce you." He did not ask for Henriette's name. He had already taken the trouble to find it out. Another little betrayal, and another clue. It was in a secluded corner of the great hall, and Henriette turned to see the woman's stately figure coming towards them across the thick carpet that deadened her footsteps. She came sailing up, her black eyes fixed upon his face. Very erect, head upright, shoulders almost squared, she moved wonderfully well. There was dignity and power in her walk. She was dressed in black, and her face was like the night. He found it impossible to say what lent her this air of impressiveness and solemnity that was almost majestic. But there was this touch of darkness and of power in the way she came that made him think of some sphinx-like figure of stone, some idol motionless in all its parts but moving as a whole and gliding across sand. Beneath those level lids her eyes stared hard at him, and a faint sensation of distress stirred in him deep, deep down. Where had he seen those eyes before? He bowed as she joined them, and Vance led the way to the armchairs in a corner of the lounge. The meeting, as the talk that followed, he felt, were all part of a preconceived plan. It had happened before. The woman, that is, was familiar to him, to some part of his being that had dropped stitches of old memory. Lady Statham. At first the name had disappointed him. So many folk were titles, as syllables in certain tongues were accents, without them being mute, unnoticed, unpronounced. Non-entities born to names so often claim attention for their insignificance in this way. But this woman, had she been Jemima Jones, would have made the name distinguished and select. She was a big and somber personality. Why was it, he wondered afterwards, that for a moment something in him shrank, and that his mind, metaphorically speaking, flung up an arm in self-protection? The instinct flashed and passed, but it seemed to him born of an automatic feeling that he must protect not himself, but the woman from the man. There was confusion in it all. Links were missing. He studied her intently. She was a woman who had none of the external feminine signals in either dress or manner. No graces, no little womanly hesitations and alarms, no daintiness, yet neither anything distinctly masculine. Her charm was strong, possessing. Only he kept forgetting that he was talking to a woman, and the things she inspired in him included, with respect and wonder, somewhere also this curious hint of dread. This instinct to protect her fled as soon as it was born, for the interest of the conversation in which she so quickly plunged him obliterated all minor emotions whatsoever. Here, for the first time, he drew close to Egypt, the Egypt he had sought so long. It was not to be explained. He felt it. Beginning with commonplaces such as, "You like Egypt, you find here what you expected," she led him into better regions with, "One finds here what one brings." He knew the delightful experience of talking fluently on subjects he was at home in, and to someone who understood. The feeling at first that to this woman he could not say mere anythings slipped into its opposite, that he could say everything. Strangers 10 minutes ago, they were at once in deep and intimate talk together. He found his ideas readily followed, agreed with up to a point, the point which permits discussion to start from a basis of general accord towards speculation. In the excitement of ideas he neglected the uncomfortable note that had stirred his caution, forgot the warning too. Her mind, moreover, seemed known to him. He was often aware of what she was going to say before he actually heard it. The current of her thoughts struck a familiar gate, and more than once he experienced vividly again the odd sensation that it all had happened before. The very sentences and phrases with which she pointed the turns of her unusual ideas were never wholly unexpected. For her ideas were decidedly unusual, in the sense that she accepted without question speculations not commonly deemed worth consideration at all, indeed not ordinarily ever known. Henriette knew them, because he had read in many fields. It was the strength of her belief that fascinated him. She offered no apologies. She knew. And while he talked, she listened with folded arms, and her black eyes fixed upon his own. Richard Vance watched with vigilant eyes and listened too, ceaselessly alert. Vance joined in little enough, however, gave no opinions, his attitude one of general acquiescence. Twice, when pauses of slackening interest made it possible, Henriette fancied he surprised another quality in this negative attitude. Interpreting it each time differently, he yet dismissed both interpretations with a smile. His imagination leaped so absurdly to violent conclusions. They were not tenable. Vance was neither her keeper, nor was he in some fashion a detective. Yet in his manner was sometimes the suggestion of the detective order. He watched with such deep attention, and he concealed it so clumsily with an affectation of careless indifference. There is nothing more dangerous than that impulsive intimacy strangers sometimes adopt when an atmosphere of mutual sympathy takes them by surprise, for it is akin to the false frankness friends affect when telling candidly one another's faults. The mood is invariably regretted later. Henriette, however, yielded to it now with something like abandon. The pleasure of talking with this woman was so unexpected and so keen. For Lady Statham believed apparently in some Egypt of her dreams. Her interest was neither historical, archaeological, nor political. It was religious, yet hardly of this earth at all. The conversation turned upon the knowledge of the ancient Egyptians from an unearthly point of view, and even while he talked he was vaguely aware that it was her mind talking through his own. She drew out his ideas and made him say them. But this he was properly aware of only afterwards, that she had cleverly, mercilessly pumped him of all he had ever known or read upon the subject. Moreover, what Vance watched so intently was himself, and the reactions in himself this remarkable woman produced. That he also realized later. His first impression that these two belonged to what may be called the crank order was justified by the conversation. But at least it was interesting crankiness, and the belief behind it made it even fascinating. Long before the end he surprised in her a more vital form of his own attitude that anything may be true, since knowledge has never yet found final answers to any of the biggest questions. He understood, from sentences dropped early in the talk, that she was among those few superstitious folk who think that the old Egyptians came closer to reading the eternal riddles of the world than any others, and that their knowledge was a remnant of that ancient wisdom religion which existed in the superb dark civilization of the sunken Atlantis, lost continent that once joined Africa to Mexico. 80,000 years ago, the dim sands of Poseidonis, great island adjoining the main continent which itself had vanished a vast period before, sank down beneath the waves, and the entire known world today was descended from its survivors. Hence the significant fact that all religions and mythological systems begin with a story of a flood, some cataclysmic upheaval that destroyed the world. Egypt itself was colonized by a group of Atlantean priests who brought their curious, deep knowledge with them. They had foreseen the cataclysm. Lady Statham talked well, bringing into her great dream this strong, insistent quality of belief in fact. She knew, from Plato to Donnelly, all that the minds of men have ever speculated upon the gorgeous legend. The evidence for such a sunken continent, Henriette had skimmed it too in years gone by, she made bewilderingly complete. He had heard Baconians demolish Shakespeare with an array of evidence equally overwhelming. It catches the imagination, though not the mind. Yet out of her facts as she presented them grew a strange likelihood. The force of this woman's personality, and her calm and quiet way of believing all she talked about, took her listener to some extent, further than ever before certainly, into the great dream after her. And the dream, to say the least, was a picturesque one, laden with wonderful possibilities. For as she talked, the spirit of old Egypt moved up, staring down upon him out of eyes lidded so curiously level. Hitherto all had prated to him of the Arabs, their ancient faith and customs, and the splendor of the Bedouins, those princes of the desert. But what he sought, barely confessed in words even to himself, was something older far than this. And this strange dark woman brought it close. Deeps in his soul, long slumbering, awoke. He heard forgotten questions. Only in this brief way could he attempt to sum up the storm she roused in him. She carried him far beyond mere outline, however, though afterwards he recalled the details with difficulty. So much more was suggested than actually expressed. She contrived to make the general modern skepticism an evidence of cheap mentality. It was so easy, the depth it affects to conceal mere emptiness. We have tried all things and found all wanting. The mind is measuring instrument, merely confessed inadequate. Various shrewd judgments of this kind increased his respect, although her acceptance went so far beyond his own. And while the label of credulity refused to stick to her, her sense of imaginative wonder enabled her to escape that dreadful compromise, a man's mind and a woman's temperament. She fascinated him. The spiritual worship of the ancient Egyptians, she held, was a symbolical explanation of things generally alluded to as the secrets of life and death. Their knowledge was a remnant of the wisdom of Atlantis. Material relics, equally misunderstood, still stood today at Karnak, Stonehenge, and in the mysterious writings on buried Mexican temples and cities, so significantly akin to the hieroglyphics upon the Egyptian tombs. "The one misinterpreted as literally as the other," she suggested, "yet both fragments of an advanced knowledge that found its grave in the sea. The wisdom of that old spiritual system has vanished from the world, only a degraded literalism left of its undecipherable language. The jewel has been lost, and the casket is filled with sand, sand, sand." How keenly her black eyes searched his own as she said it, and how oddly she made the little word resound. The syllable drew out almost into chanting. Echoes answered from the depths within him, carrying it on and on across some desert of forgotten belief. Veils of sand flew everywhere about his mind. Curtains lifted. Whole hills of sand went shifting into level surfaces, whence gardens of dim outline emerged to meet the sunlight. "But the sand may be removed." It was her nephew speaking almost for the first time, and the interruption had an odd effect, introducing a sharply practical element. For the tone expressed, so far as he dared express it, disapproval. It was a baited observation, an invitation to opinion. "We are not sand diggers, Mr. Henriot," put in Lady Statham before he decided to respond. "Our object is quite another one, and I believe, I have a feeling," she added almost questioningly, "that you might be interested enough to help us, perhaps." He only wondered the direct attack had not come sooner. Its bluntness hardly surprised him. He felt himself leap forward to accept it. A sudden subsistence had freed his feet. Then the warning operated suddenly, for an instant. Henriot was interested. More, he was half seduced. But as yet he did not mean to be included in their purposes, whatever these might be. That shrinking dread came back a moment, and was gone again before he could question it. His eyes looked fully at Lady Statham. "What is it that you know?" they asked her. "Tell me the things we once knew together, you and I. These words are merely trifling. And why does another man now stand in my place? For the sands heaped upon my memory are shifting, and it is you who are moving them away." His soul whispered it. His voice said quite another thing, although the words he used seemed oddly chosen. "There is much in the ideas of ancient Egypt that has attracted me ever since I can remember, though I have never caught up with anything definite enough to follow. There was majesty somewhere in their conceptions, a large, calm majesty of spiritual dominion, one might call it, perhaps. I am interested." Her face remained expressionless as she listened, but there was grave conviction in the eyes that held him like a spell. He saw through them into dim, faint pictures, whose background was always sand. He forgot that he was speaking with a woman who half an hour ago had been a stranger to him. He followed these faded mental pictures, though he never caught them up. It was like his dream in London. Lady Statham was talking. He had not noticed the means by which she effected the abrupt transition. Of familiar beliefs of old Egypt, of the Ka, or double, by whose existence the survival of the soul was possible, even its return into manifested physical life, of the astrology or influence of the heavenly bodies upon all sublunar activities, of terrific forms of other life, known to the ancient worship of Atlantis, great potencies that might be invoked by ritual and ceremonial, and of their lesser influence as recognized in certain lower forms, hence treated with veneration as the sacred animal branch of this dim religion. And she spoke lightly of the modern learning which so glibly imagined it was the animals themselves that were looked upon as gods, the bull, the bird, the crocodile, the cat. "It's there they all go so absurdly wrong," she said, "taking the symbol for the power symbolized. Yet natural enough. The mind today wears blinkers, studies only the details seen directly before it. Had none of us experienced love, we should think the first lover mad. Few today know the powers they knew, hence deny them. If the world were deaf, it would stand with mockery before a hearing group swayed by an orchestra, pitying both listeners and performers. It would deem our admiration of a great swinging bell mere foolish worship of form and movement. Similarly, with high powers that once expressed themselves in common forms, where best they could, being themselves bodiless. The learned men classify the forms with painstaking detail, but deity has gone out of life. The powers symbolized are no longer experienced." "These powers, you suggest, then, their cause, as it were, may still—" But she waved aside the interruption. "They are satisfied as the common people were with a degraded literalism," she went on. "Not was the heavens, who spread herself across the earth in the form of a woman. Shu, the vastness of space. The ibis typified Thoth, and Hathor was the patron of the western hills. Khonsu, the moon, was personified, as was the deity of the Nile. But the high priest of Ra, the sun, you notice, remained ever the great one of visions." The high priest, the great one of visions. How wonderfully again she made the sentence sing. She put splendor into it. The pictures shifted suddenly closer in his mind. He saw the grandeur of Memphis and Heliopolis rise against the stars and shake the sand of ages from their stern old temples. "You think it possible, then, to get in touch with these high powers you speak of, powers once manifested in common forms?" Henriette asked the question with a degree of conviction and solemnity that surprised himself. The scenery changed about him as he listened. The spacious halls of this former Khedivial palace melted into desert spaces. He smelt the open wilderness, the sand that haunted Helouan. The soft-footed Arab servants moved across the hall in their white sheets, like eddies of dust the wind stirred from the Libyan dunes. And over these two strangers close beside him stole a queer, indefinite alteration. Moods and emotions, nameless as unknown stars, rose through his soul, trailing dark mists of memory from unfathomable distances. Lady Statham answered him indirectly. He found himself wishing that those steady eyes would sometimes close. "Love is known only by feeling it," she said, her voice deepening a little. "Behind the form you feel the person loved. The process is an evocation, pure and simple. An arduous ceremonial involving worship and devotional preparation is the means. It is a difficult ritual, the only one acknowledged by the world as still effectual. Ritual is the passageway of the soul into the infinite." He might have said the words himself. The thought lay in him while she uttered it. Evocation everywhere in life was as true as assimilation. Nevertheless, he stared his companion full in the eyes with a touch of almost rude amazement. But no further questions prompted themselves, or rather, he declined to ask them. He recalled somehow uneasily that in ceremonial the points of the compass have significance, standing for forces and activities that sleep there until invoked, and a passing light fell upon that curious midnight request in the corridor upstairs. These two were on the track of undesirable experiments, he thought. They wished to include him, too. "You go at night sometimes into the desert?" he heard himself saying. It was impulsive and miscalculated. His feeling that it would be wise to change the conversation resulted in giving it fresh impetus instead. "We saw you there, in the Wadi Hof," put in Vance, suddenly breaking his long silence. "You too sleep out, then? It means you know the Valley of Fear." "We wondered," it was Lady Statham's voice, and she leaned forward eagerly as she said it, then abruptly left the sentence incomplete. Henriette started. A sense of momentary acute discomfort again ran over him. The same second she continued, though obviously changing the phrase. "We wondered how you spent your day there, during the heat. But you paint, don't you? You draw, I mean?" The commonplace question, he realized in every fiber of his being, meant something they deemed significant. Was it his talent for drawing that they sought to use him for? Even as he answered with a simple affirmative, he had a flash of intuition that might be fanciful, yet that might be true. That this extraordinary pair were intent upon some ceremony of evocation that should summon into actual physical expression some power, some type of life, known long ago to ancient worship, and that they even sought to fix its bodily outline with a pencil. His pencil. A gateway of incredible adventure opened at his feet. He balanced on the edge of knowing unutterable things. Here was a clue that might lead him towards the hidden Egypt he had ever craved to know. An awful hand was beckoning. The sands were shifting. He saw the million eyes of the desert watching him from beneath the level lids of centuries. Speck by speck and grain by grain, the sand that smothered memory lifted the countless wrappings that embalmed it. And he was willing, yet afraid. Why in the world did he hesitate and shrink? Why was it that the presence of this silent, watching personality in the chair beside him kept caution still alive, with warning close behind? The pictures in his mind were gorgeously colored. It was Richard Vance who somehow streaked them through with black. A thing of darkness born of this man's unassertive presence flitted ever across the scenery, marring its grandeur with something evil, petty, dreadful. He held a horrible thought alive. His mind was thinking venal purposes. In Henriette himself, imagination had grown curiously heated, fed by what had been suggested rather than actually said. Ideas of immensity crowded his brain, yet never assumed definite shape. They were familiar, even as the strange woman was familiar. Once long ago he had known them well, had even practiced them beneath these bright Egyptian stars. Whence came this prodigious glad excitement in his heart, this sense of mighty powers coaxed down to influence the very details of daily life? Behind them, for all their vagueness, lay an archetypal splendor, fraught with forgotten meanings. He had always been aware of it in this mysterious land, but it had ever hitherto eluded him. It hovered everywhere. He had felt it brooding behind the towering colossi at Thebes, in the skeletons of wasted temples, in the uncouth comeliness of the Sphinx, and the crude terror of the pyramids even. Over the whole of Egypt hung its invisible wings. These were but isolated fragments of the body that might express it, and the desert remained its cleanest, truest symbol. Sand knew it closest. Sand might even give it bodily form and outline. But while it escaped description in his mind, as equally it eluded visualization in his soul, he felt that it combined with its vastness something infinitely small as well, of such wee particles as the giant desert born. Henriette started nervously in his chair, convicted once more of unconscionable staring. And at the same moment a group of hotel people, returning from a dance, passed through the hall and nodded him good night. The scent of the women reached him, and with it the sound of their voices discussing personalities just left behind. A London atmosphere came with them. He caught trivial phrases, uttered in a drawling tone, and followed by the shrill laughter of a girl. They passed upstairs, discussing their little things like marionettes upon a tiny stage. But their passage brought him back to things of modern life, and to some standard of familiar measurement. The pictures that his soul had gazed at so deep within, he realized, were a pictorial transfer, caught in completely from this woman's vivid mind. He had seen the desert as the gray enormous tomb where hovered still the Ka of ancient Egypt. Sand screened her visage with the veil of centuries. But she was there, and she was living. Egypt herself had pitched a temporary camp in him, and then moved on. There was a momentary break, a sense of abruptness and dislocation. And then he became aware that Lady Statham had been speaking for some time before he caught her actual words, and that a certain change had come into her voice, as also into her manner. 5. She was leaning closer to him, her face suddenly glowing and alive. Through the stone figure coursed the fires of a passion that deepened the coal-black eyes and communicated a hint of light, of exaltation, to her whole person. It was incredibly moving. To this deep passion was due the power he had felt. It was her entire life. She lived for it. She would die for it. Her calmness of manner enhanced its effect. Hence the strength of those first impressions that had stormed him. The woman had belief, however wild and strange. It was sacred to her. The secret of her influence was conviction. His attitude shifted several points then. The wonder in him passed over into awe. The things she knew were real. They were not merely imaginative speculations. "I knew I was not wrong in thinking you in sympathy with this line of thought," she was saying in lower voice, steady with earnestness, and as though she had read his mind. "You, too, know, though perhaps you hardly realize that you know. It lies so deep in you that you only get vague feelings of it, intimations of memory. Isn't that the case?" Henriette gave assent with his eyes. It was the truth. "What we know instinctively," she continued, "is simply what we are trying to remember. Knowledge is memory." She paused a moment, watching his face closely. "At least you are free from that cheap skepticism which labels these old beliefs as superstition." It was not even a question. "I worship real belief of any kind," he stammered, for her words and the close proximity of her atmosphere caused a strange upheaval in his heart that he could not account for. He faltered in his speech. "It is the most vital quality in life, rarer than deity." He was using her own phrases even. "It is creative. It constructs the world anew." "And may reconstruct the old." She said it, lifting her face above him a little, so that her eyes looked down into his own. It grew big and somehow masculine. It was the face of a priest, spiritual power in it. Where, oh where, in the echoing past, had he known this woman's soul? He saw her in another setting, a forest of columns, dim about her, towering above giant aisles. Again he felt the desert had come close. Into this tent-like hall of the hotel came the sifting of tiny sand. It heaped softly about the very furniture against his feet, blocking the exits of door and window. It shrouded the little present. The wind that brought it stirred a veil that had hung for ages motionless. She had been saying many things that he had missed while his mind went searching. There were types of life the Atlantean system knew it might revive. Life unmanifested today, in any bodily form, was the sentence he caught with his return to the actual present. A type of life? He whispered, looking about him as though to see who it was had joined them. You mean a soul? Some kind of soul, alien to humanity or to any forms of living thing in the world today? What she had been saying reached him somehow, it seemed, though he had not heard the words themselves. Still hesitating, he was yet so eager to hear. Already he felt she meant to include him in her purposes, and that in the end he must go willingly. So strong was her persuasion on his mind. And he felt as if he knew vaguely what was coming. Before she answered his curious question, prompting it indeed, rose in his mind that strange idea of the group soul, the theory that big souls cannot express themselves in a single individual, but need an entire group for their full manifestation. He listened intently. The reflection that his sudden intimacy was unnatural he rejected, for many conversations were really gathered into one. Long watching and preparation on both sides had cleared the way for the ripening of acquaintance into confidence. How long, he dimly wondered. But if this conception of the group soul was not new, the suggestion Lady Statham developed out of it was both new and startling, and yet always so curiously familiar. Its value for him lay not in far-fetched evidence that supported it, but in the deep belief which made it a vital asset, in an honest inner life. "An individual,"
she said quietly. "One soul expressed completely in a single person, is exceedingly rare. Not often is a physical instrument found perfect enough to provide it with adequate expression. In the lower ranges of humanity, certainly in animal and insect life, one soul is shared by many. Behind a tribe of savages stands one savage. A flock of birds is a single bird, scattered through the consciousness of all. They wheel in mid-air, they migrate, they obey the deep intelligence called instinct, all as one. The life of any one lion is the life of all. The lion group soul that manifests itself in the entire genus. An ant heap is a single ant. Through the bees spreads the consciousness of a single bee."
Henriette knew what she was working up to. In his eagerness to hasten disclosure, he interrupted. "And there may be types of life that have no corresponding bodily expression at all, then?" he asked as though the question were forced out of him. "They exist as powers, unmanifested on the earth today."
"Powers," she answered, watching him closely with unswerving stare, "that need a group to provide their body, their physical expression, if they came back."
"Came back," he repeated below his breath. But she heard him.
"They once had expression. Egypt, Atlantis knew them. Spiritual powers that never visit the world today.
Bodies," he whispered softly.
"Actual bodies? Their sphere of action, you see, would be their body, and it might be physical outline. So potent a descent of spiritual life would select materials for its body where it could find them. Our conventional notion of a body, what is it? A single outline moving all together in one direction. For little human souls or fragments, this is sufficient. But for vaster types of soul, an entire host would be required."
"A church?" he ventured. "Some body of belief, you surely mean." She bowed her head a moment in assent. She was determined he should seize her meaning fully.
"A wave of spiritual awakening, a descent of spiritual life upon a nation," she answered slowly, "forms itself a church, and the body of true believers are its sphere of action. They are literally its bodily expression. Each individual believer is a corpuscle in that body. The power has provided itself with a vehicle of manifestation, otherwise we could not know it. And the more real the belief of each individual, the more perfect the expression of the spiritual life behind them all. A group soul walks the earth. Moreover, a nation naturally devout could attract a type of soul unknown to a nation that denies all faith. Faith brings back the gods, but today belief is dead, and deity has left the world."
She talked on, developing this main idea that in days of older faiths there were deific types of life upon the earth, evoked by worship and beneficial to humanity. They had long ago withdrawn because the worship which brought them down had died to the death. The world had grown pettier. These vast centers of spiritual power found no body in which they now could express themselves or manifest. Her thoughts and phrases poured over him like sand. It was always sand, he felt, burying the present and uncovering the past. He tried to steady his mind upon familiar objects, but wherever he looked, sand stared him in the face. Outside these trivial walls, the desert lay listening. It lay waiting, too. Vance himself had dropped out of recognition. He belonged to the world of things today. But this woman and himself stood thousands of years away, beneath the columns of a temple in the sands. And the sands were moving. His feet went shifting with them, running down vistas of ageless memory that woke terror by their sheer immensity of distance. Like a muffled voice that called to him through many veils and wrappings, he heard her describe the stupendous powers that evocation might coax down again among the world of men. "To what useful end?" he asked at length, amazed at his own temerity, and because he knew instinctively the answer in advance. It rose through these layers of coiling memory in his soul.
"The extension of spiritual knowledge and the widening of life," she answered. "The link with the unearthly kingdom wherein this ancient system went forever searching would be re-established. Complete rehabilitation might follow. Little portions of these powers express themselves naturally once in certain animal types, instinctive life that did not deny or reject them. The worship of sacred animals was the relic of a once gigantic system of evocation, not of monsters," and she smiled sadly, "but of powers that were willing and ready to descend when worship summoned them."
Again, beneath his breath, Henriette heard himself murmur. His own voice startled him as he whispered it.
"Actual bodily shape and outline?" "Material for bodies is everywhere," she answered equally low. "Dust, to which we all return. Sand, if you prefer it. Fine, fine sand. Life molds it easily enough when that life is potent."
A certain confusion spread slowly through his mind as he heard her. He lit a cigarette and smoked some minutes in silence. Lady Statham and her nephew waited for him to speak. At length, after some inner battling and hesitation, he put the question that he knew they waited for. It was impossible to resist any longer. "It would be interesting to know the method," he said, "and to revive, perhaps, by experiment." Before he could complete his thought, she took him up.
"There are some who claim to know it,"
she said gravely, her eyes a moment masterful.
"A clue, thus followed, might lead to the entire reconstruction I spoke of."
"And the method?" he repeated faintly.
"Evoke the power by ceremonial evocation. The ritual is obtainable, and note the form it assumes. Then establish it. The shape or outline once secured could then be made permanent. A mold for its return at will, its natural physical expression here on earth."
"Idol!" he exclaimed.
"Image," she replied at once. "Life, before we can know it, must have a body. Our souls, in order to manifest here, need a material vehicle."
"And to obtain this form or outline," he began, "to fix it, rather?"
"Would be required the clever pencil of a fearless looker-on, someone not engaged in the actual evocation. This form, accurately made permanent in solid matter, say in stone, would provide a channel always open. Experiment, properly speaking, might then begin. The cisterns of power behind would be accessible."
"An amazing proposition," Henriette exclaimed. What surprised him was that he felt no desire to laugh, and little even to doubt.
"Yet known to every religion that ever deserved the name,"
put in Vance like a voice from a distance. Blackness came somehow with his interruption, a touch of darkness. He spoke eagerly. To all the talk that followed, and there was much of it, Henriette listened with but half an ear. This one idea stormed through him with an uproar that killed attention. Judgment was held utterly in abeyance. He carried away from it some vague suggestion that this woman had hinted at previous lives she half remembered, and that every year she came to Egypt, haunting the sands and temples in the effort to recover lost clues. And he recalled afterwards that she said, "This all came to me as a child, just as though it was something half remembered." There was the further suggestion that he himself was not unknown to her, that they too had met before. But this, compared to the grave certainty of the rest, was merest fantasy that did not hold his attention. He answered, hardly knowing what he said. His preoccupation with other thoughts deep down was so intense that he was probably barely polite, uttering empty phrases with his mind elsewhere. His one desire was to escape and be alone, and it was with genuine relief that he presently excused himself and went upstairs to bed. The halls, he noticed, were empty. An Arab servant waited to put the lights out. He walked up, for the lift had long ceased running, and the magic of old Egypt stalked beside him. The studies that had fascinated his mind in earlier youth returned with the power that had subdued his mind in boyhood. The cult of Osiris woke in his blood again. Horus and Nephthys stirred in their long-forgotten centers.
There revived in him, too long buried, the awful glamour of those liturgical rites and vast body of observances, those spells and formulae of incantation of the oldest known recension that years ago had captured his imagination and belief. The Book of the Dead. Trumpet voices called to his heart again, across the desert of some dim past. There were forms of life, impulses from the creative power which is the universe, other than the soul of man. They could be known. A spiritual exaltation, roused by the words and presence of this singular woman, shouted to him as he went. Then, as he closed his bedroom door, carefully locking it, there stood beside him Vance. The forgotten figure of Vance came up close. The watching eyes, the simulated interest, the feigned belief, the detective mental attitude, these broke through the grandiose panorama, bringing darkness. Vance, strong personality that hid behind assumed nonentity for some purpose of his own, intruded with sudden violence, demanding an explanation of his presence. And with an equal suddenness, explanation offered itself then and there. It came unsought, its horror of certainty utterly unjustified, and it came in this unexpected fashion. Behind the interest and acquiescence of the man ran fear. But behind the vivid fear ran another thing that Henriette now perceived was vile. For the first time in his life, Henriette knew it at close quarters, actual, ready to operate. Though familiar enough in daily life to be of common occurrence, Henriette had never realized it as he did now, so close and terrible. In the same way he had never realized that he would die, vanish from the busy world of men and women, forgotten as though he had never existed, an eddy of wind-blown dust. And in the man named Richard Vance, this thing was close upon blossom. Henriette could not name it to himself. Even in thought, it appalled him. He undressed hurriedly, almost with the child's idea of finding safety between the sheets. His mind undressed itself as well. The business of the day laid itself automatically aside. The will sank down. Desire grew inactive. Henriette was exhausted. But in that stage towards slumber when thinking stops, and only fugitive pictures pass across the mind in shadowy dance, his brain ceased shouting its mechanical explanations, and his soul unveiled a peering eye. Great limbs of memory, smothered by the activities of the present, stirred their stiffened lengths through the sands of long ago, sands this woman had begun to excavate from some far-off pre-existence they had surely known together. Vagueness and certainty ran hand in hand. Details were unrecoverable, but the emotions in which they were embedded moved. He turned restlessly in his bed, striving to seize the amazing clues and follow them. But deliberate effort hid them instantly again. They retired instantly into the subconscious. With the brain of this body he now occupied, they had nothing to do. The brain stored memories of each life only. This ancient script was graven in his soul, subconscious alone could interpret and reveal, and it was his subconscious memory that Lady Statham had been so busily excavating. Dimly it stirred and moved about the depths within him, never clearly seen, indefinite, felt as a yearning after unrecoverable knowledge. Against the darker background of Vance's fear and sinister purpose, both of this present life and recent, he saw the grandeur of this woman's impossible dream, and knew, beyond argument or reason, that it was true. Judgment and will asleep, he left the impossibility aside and took the grandeur. The belief of Lady Statham was not credulity and superstition. It was memory. Still to this day over the sands of Egypt hovered immense spiritual potencies, so vast that they could only know physical expression in a group, in many. Their sphere of bodily manifestation must be a host, each individual unit in that host a corpuscle in the whole. The wind, rising from the Libyan wastes across the Nile, swept up against the exposed side of the hotel and made his windows rattle. The old sad winds of Egypt. Henriette got out of bed to fasten the outside shutters. He stood a moment and watched the moon floating down behind the Saqqara pyramids. The Pleiades and Orion's belt hung brilliantly. The Great Bear was close to the horizon. In the sky above the desert swung 10,000 stars. No sounds rose from the streets of Helouan. The tide of sand was coming slowly in. And a flock of enormous thoughts, swooped past him from fields of this unbelievable lost memory. The desert, pale in the moon, was coextensive with the night, too huge for comfort or understanding, yet charged to the brim with infinite peace. Behind its majesty of silence lay whispers of a vanished language that once could call with power upon mighty spiritual agencies. Its skirts were folded now, but slowly across the leagues of sand they began to stir and rearrange themselves. He grew suddenly aware of this enveloping shroud of sand as the raw material of bodily expression, form. The sand was in his imagination and his mind. Shaking loosely the folds of its gigantic skirts, it rose. It moved a little towards him. He saw the eternal countenance of the desert watching him, immobile and unchanging behind these shifting veils. The winds lay so carefully over it. Egypt, the ancient Egypt, turned in her vast sarcophagus of desert, wakening from her sleep of ages at the belief of approaching worshippers. Only in this insignificant manner could he express a letter of the terrific language that crowded to seek expression through his soul. He closed the shutters and carefully fastened them. He turned to go back to bed, curiously trembling. Then, as he did so, the whole singular delusion caught him with a shock that held him motionless. Up rose the stupendous apparition of the entire desert, and stood behind him on that balcony. Swift as thought, in silence, the desert stood on end against his very face. It towered across the sky, hiding Orion and the moon. It dipped below the horizons. The whole gray sheet of it rose up before his eyes and stood. Through its unfolding skirts ran 10,000 eddies of swirling sand, as the creases of its grave clothes smoothed themselves out in moonlight. And a bleak, scarred countenance, huge as a planet, gazed down into his own. Through his dreamless sleep that night, two things lay active and awake, in the subconscious part that knows no slumber. They were incongruous. One was evil, small and human, the other unearthly and sublime. For the memory of the fear that haunted Vance, and the sinister cause of it, pricked at him all night long. But beyond this common intelligible emotion, lay the crowding wonder that caught his soul with glory. The sand was stirring. The desert was awake. Ready to mate with them in material form, brooded close the caw of that colossal entity that once expressed itself through the myriad life of ancient Egypt. 6. Next day, and for several days following, Henriette kept out of the path of Lady Statham and her nephew. The acquaintanceship had grown too rapidly to be quite comfortable. It was easy to pretend that he took people at their face value, but it was a pose. One liked to know something of antecedents. It was otherwise difficult to place them, and Henriette, for the life of him, could not place these two. His subconsciousness brought explanation when it came, but the subconsciousness is only temporarily active. When it retired, he floundered without a rudder, in confusion. With the flood of morning sunshine, the value of much she had said evaporated. Her presence alone had supplied the key to the cipher. But while the indigestible portions he rejected, there remained a good deal he had already assimilated. The discomfort remained, and with it the grave, unholy reality of it all. It was something more than theory. Results would follow, if he joined them. He would witness curious things. The force with which it drew him brought hesitation. It operated in him like a shock that numbs at first by its abrupt arrival, and needs time to realize in the right proportions to the rest of life. These right proportions, however, did not come readily, and his emotions ranged between skeptical laughter and complete acceptance. The one detail he felt certain of was this dreadful thing he had divined in Vance. Trying hard to disbelieve it, he found he could not. It was true. Though without a shred of real evidence to support it, the horror of it remained. He knew it in his very bones. And this, perhaps, was what drove him to seek the comforting companionship of folk he understood and felt at home with. He told his host and hostess about the strangers, though omitting the actual conversation because they would merely smile in blank miscomprehension. But the moment he described the strong black eyes beneath the level eyelids, his hostess turned with a start, her interest deeply roused.
"Why, it's that awful Statham woman!" she exclaimed. "That must be Lady Statham. and the man she calls her nephew."
"Sounds like it, certainly," her husband added. "Felix, you'd better clear out. They'll bewitch you too."
And Henriette bridled, yet wondering why he did so. He drew into his shell a little, giving the merest sketch of what had happened. But he listened closely while these two practical old friends supplied him with information in the gossiping way that human nature loves. No doubt there was much embroidery, and more perversion, exaggeration too, but the account evidently rested upon some basis of solid foundation for all that. Smoke and fire go together always.
"He is her nephew, right enough,"
Mansfield corrected his wife, before proceeding to his own man's form of elaboration.
"No question about that, I believe. He's her favorite nephew, and she's as rich as a pig. He follows her out here every year, waiting for her empty shoes. But they are an unsavory couple. I've met 'em in various parts, all over Egypt, but they always come back to Helouan in the end. And the stories about them are simply legion. You remember?"
He turned hesitatingly to his wife.
"Some people, I heard,"
he changed his sentence,
"were made quite ill by her."
"I'm sure Felix ought to know, yes."
His wife boldly took him up.
"My niece Fanny had the most extraordinary experience."
She turned to Henriette.
"Her room was next to Lady Statham in some hotel or other, at Assuan or Edfu, and one night she woke and heard a kind of mysterious chanting, or intoning next her. Hotel doors are so dreadfully thin. There was a funny smell, too, like incense of something sickly, and a man's voice kept chiming in. It went on for hours, while she lay terrified in bed."
"Frightened, you say?" asked Henriette.
"Out of her skin, yes. She said it was so uncanny. Made her feel icy. She wanted to ring the bell, but was afraid to leave her bed. The room was full of things, yet she could see nothing. She felt them, you see. And after a bit, the sound of this sing-song voice so got on her nerves it half dazed her, a kind of enchantment. She felt choked and suffocated. And then—"
It was her turn to hesitate.
"Tell it all,"
her husband said, quite gravely too.
"Well, something came in. At least, she describes it oddly, rather. She said it made the door bulge inwards from the next room. But not the door alone. The walls bulged or swayed, as if a huge thing pressed against them from the other side. And at the same moment, her windows— she had 2 big balconies, and the Venetian shutters were fastened— both her windows darkened, though it was 2 in the morning and pitch dark outside. She said it was all one thing, trying to get in, just as water, you see, would rush in through every hole and opening it could find, and all at once. And in spite of her terror, that's the odd part of it, she said she felt a kind of splendor in her, a sort of elation."
"She saw nothing?"
"She says she doesn't remember. Her senses left her, I believe, though she won't admit it."
"Fainted for a minute, probably,"
said Mansfield.
"So there it is,"
his wife concluded, after a silence.
"And that's true. It happened to my niece, didn't it, John?"
Stories and legendary accounts of strange things that the presence of these two brought poured out then. They were obviously somewhat mixed, one account borrowing picturesque details from another, and all in disproportion, as when people tell stories in a language they are little familiar with. But listening with avidity, yet also with uneasiness, somehow Henriette put 2 and 2 together. Truth stood behind them somewhere. These two held traffic with the powers that ancient Egypt knew.
"Tell Felix, dear, about the time you met the nephew, horrid creature, in the Valley of the Kings,"
he heard his wife say presently, and Mansfield told it plainly enough, evidently glad to get it done, though.
"It was some years ago, and I didn't know who he was then, or anything about him. I don't know much more now, except that he's a dangerous sort of charlatan devil, I think. But I came across him one night up there by Thebes in the Valley of the Kings. You know, where they buried all their Johnnies with so much magnificence and processions and masses and all the rest. It's the most astounding, the most haunted place you ever saw. Gloomy, silent, full of gorgeous lights and shadows that seem alive. Terribly impressive. It makes you creep and shudder. You feel old Egypt watching you."
"Get on, dear,"
said his wife. "Well, I was coming home late on a blasted lazy donkey, dog-tired into the bargain, when my donkey boy suddenly ran for his life and left me alone. It was after sunset. The sand was red and shining, and the big cliffs sort of fiery, and my donkey stuck its 4 feet in the ground and wouldn't budge. Then, about 50 yards away, I saw a fellow, European apparently, doing something, heaven knows what, for I can't describe it, among the boulders that lie all over the ground there. Ceremony, I suppose you'd call it. I was so interested that at first I watched. Then I saw he wasn't alone. There were a lot of moving things round him, towering big things that came and went like shadows. That twilight is fearfully bewildering. Perspective changes and distance gets all confused. It's fearfully hard to see properly. I remember that I got off my donkey and went up closer. And when I was within a dozen yards of him, well, it sounds such rot, you know, but I swear the thing suddenly rushed off and left him there alone. They went with a roaring noise like wind. Shadowy but tremendously big they were, and they vanished up against the fiery precipices, as though they slipped bang into the stone itself. The only thing I can think of to describe them is, well, those sandstorms the Commerson raises. The hot winds, you know.
They probably were sand,
his wife suggested, burning to tell another story of her own.
Possibly, only there wasn't a breath of wind, and it was hot as blazes, and I had such extraordinary sensations. Never felt anything like it before. Wild and exhilarated. Drunk, I tell you. Drunk.
You saw them? Asked Henriette. You made out their shape at all, or outline?
Sphinx, he replied at once, for all the world like sphinxes. You know the kind of face and head these limestone strata in the desert take? Great visages with square Egyptian headdresses, where the driven sand has eaten away the softer stuff beneath. You see it everywhere. Enormous idols they seem, with faces and eyes and lips awfully like the Sphinx. Well, that's the nearest I can get to it.
He puffed his pipe hard, but there was no sign of levity in him. He told the actual truth as far as in him lay, yet half ashamed of what he told, and a good deal he left out too.
She's got a face of the same sort, that Statham horror, his wife said with a shiver. Reduce the size and paint in awful black eyes, and you've got her exactly. A living idol.
And all three laughed, yet a laughter without merriment in it. And you spoke to the man?
I did, the Englishman answered, though I confess I'm a bit ashamed of the way I spoke. Fact is, I was excited, thunderingly excited, and felt a kind of anger. I wanted to kick the beggar for practising such bally rubbish, and in such a place too. Yet all the time, well, I believe it was sheer funk now. He laughed, for I felt uncommonly queer out there in the dusk, alone with that kind of business. And I was angry with myself for feeling it. Anyhow, I went up. I'd lost my donkey boy as well, remember, and slated him like a dog. I can't remember what I said exactly, only that he stood and stared at me in silence. That made it worse. Seemed twice as real then. The beggar said no single word the whole time. He signed to me with one hand to clear out. And then suddenly, out of nothing, that woman, appeared and stood beside him. I never saw her come. She must have been behind some boulder or other, for she simply rose out of the ground. She stood there and stared at me too, bang in the face. She was turned towards the sunset, what was left of it in the west, and her black eye shone like... I can't describe it. It was shocking.
She spoke?
She said 5 words, and her voice, it'll make you laugh. It was metallic like a gong. You are in danger here. That's all she said. I simply turned and cleared out as fast as I ever could. But I had to go on foot. My donkey had followed its boy long before. I tell you, smile as you may, my blood was all curdled for an hour afterwards.
Then he explained that he felt some kind of explanation or apology was due, since the couple lodged in his own hotel, and how he approached the man in the smoking room after dinner. A conversation resulted. The man was quite intelligent, after all, of which only one sentence had remained in his mind.
Perhaps you can explain it, Felix. I wrote it down as well as I could remember. The rest confused me beyond words and memory, though I must confess it did not seem, not utter rot exactly. It was about astrology and rituals, and the worship of the old Egyptians, and I don't know what else besides, only he made it intelligible and almost sensible. If only I could have got the hang of the thing enough to remember it. You know, he added as though believing in spite of himself, There is a lot of that wonderful old Egyptian religious business still hanging about in the atmosphere of this place. Say what you like."
"But this sentence?" Henriette asked, and the other went off to get a notebook where he had written it down.
"He was jawing, you see," he continued when he came back.
Henriette and his wife having kept silence meanwhile.
"About direction being of importance in religious ceremonies, west and north symbolizing certain powers or something of the kind, why people turn to the east and all that sort of thing, and speaking of the whole universe as if it had living forces tucked away in it that express themselves somehow when roused up. That's how I remember it anyhow. And then he said this thing, in answer to some fool question probably that I put," and he read out of the notebook. "You were in danger because you came through the gateway of the west, and the powers from the gateway of the east were at that moment rising, and therefore in direct opposition to you."
Then came the following, apparently a simile offered by way of explanation. Mansfield read it in a shamefaced tone, evidently prepared for laughter.
"Whether I strike you on the back or in the face determines what kind of answering force I rouse in you. Direction is significant." And he said it was the period called the Night of Power, time when the desert encroaches and spirits are close.
And tossing the book aside, he lit his pipe again and waited a moment to hear what might be said.
"Can you explain such gibberish?"
he asked at length, as neither of his listeners spoke. But Henriette said he couldn't, and the wife then took up her own tale of stories that had grown about this singular couple. These were less detailed and therefore less impressive, but all contributed something towards the atmosphere of reality that framed the entire picture. They belonged to the type one hears at every dinner party in Egypt. Stories of the vengeance mummies seemed to take on those who robbed them, desecrating their peace of centuries, of a woman wearing a necklace of scarabs taken from a princess's tomb, who felt hands about her throat to strangle her, of little Ka figures, poshed goddesses, amulets, and the rest, that brought curious disaster to those who kept them. They are many and various, astonishingly circumstantial often, and vouched for by persons the reverse of credulous. The modern superstition that haunts the desert gullies with Afrits had nothing in common with them. They rest upon a basis of indubitable experience, and they remain inexplicable. And about the personalities of Lady Statham and her nephew, they crowded like flies attracted by a dish of fruit. The Arabs, too, were afraid of her. She had difficulty in getting guides and dragomen.
"My dear chap," concluded Mansfield, "take my advice and have nothing to do with them. There's a lot of queer business knocking about in this old country, and people like that know ways of reviving it somehow. It's upset you already. You looked scared. I thought the moment you came in."
They laughed, but the Englishman was in earnest.
"I tell you what," he added, "we'll go off for a bit of shooting together. The fields along the delta are packed with birds now. They're home early this year on their way back to the north. What do you say, eh?"
But Henriette did not care about the quail shooting. He felt more inclined to be alone and think things out by himself. He had come to his friends for comfort, and instead they had made him uneasy and excited. His interest had suddenly doubled. Though half afraid, he longed to know what these two were up to follow the adventure to the bitter end. He disregarded the warning of his host as well as the premonition in his own heart. The sand had caught his feet. There were moments when he laughed in utter disbelief, but these were optimistic moods that did not last. He always returned to the feeling that truth lurked somewhere in the whole strange business, and that if he joined forces with them, as they seemed to wish, he would witness, well, he hardly knew what. But it enticed him as danger does the reckless man, or death the suicide. The sand had caught his mind. He decided to offer himself to all they wanted. His pencil, too. He would see. A shiver ran through him at the thought. What they saw. And know some eddy of that vanished tide of power and splendor the ancient Egyptian priesthood knew, and that perhaps was even common experience in the far-off days of dim Atlantis. The sand had caught his imagination, too. He was utterly sand-haunted. Sand, Part 3. And so he took pains, though without making definite suggestion, to place himself in the way of this woman and her nephew, only to find that his hints were disregarded. They left him alone if they did not actually avoid him. Moreover, he rarely came across them now. Only at night, or in the queer dusk hours, he caught glimpses of them moving hurriedly off from the hotel, and always desertwards. And their disregard, well calculated, inflamed his desire to the point when he almost decided to propose himself. Quite suddenly, then, the idea flashed through him. How do they come, these odd revelations, when the mind lies receptive like a plate sensitized by anticipation? That they were waiting for a certain date, and with a certain notion came Mansfield's remark about the night of power, believed in by the old Egyptian calendar as a time when the supersensuous world moves close against the minds of men with all its troop of possibilities. And the thought, once lodged in its corner of imagination, grew strong. He looked it up. 10 days from now he found Lael el Sud would be upon him, with a moon, too, at the full. And this strange hint of guidance he accepted. In his present mood, as he admitted, smiling to himself, he could accept anything. It was part of it. It belonged to the adventure. But even while he persuaded himself that it was play, the solemn reality of what lay ahead increased amazingly, sketched darkly in his very soul. These intervening days he spent as best he could, impatiently, a prey to quite opposite emotions. In the blazing sunshine he thought of it and laughed, but at night he lay often sleepless, calculating chances of escape. He never did escape, however. The desert that watched little Heloan with great, unwinking eyes watched also every turn and twist he made. Like this oasis, he basked in the sun of older time, and dreamed beneath forgotten moons. The sand at last had crept into his inmost heart. It sifted over him. Seeking a reaction from normal everyday things, he made tourist trips. Yet, while recognizing the comedy in his attitude, he never could lose sight of the grandeur that banked it up so hauntingly. These two contrary emotions grafted themselves on all he did and saw. He crossed the Nile at Bedrashin, and went again to the tomb world of Saqqara. But through all the chatter of veiled and helmeted tourists, the Bandar log of our modern jungle, ran this dark understream of awe their monkey methods could not turn aside. One world lay upon another, but this modern layer was a shallow crust that, like the phenomenon of the desert film, a mere angle of falling light could instantly obliterate. Beneath the sand, deep down, he passed along the street of tombs, as he had often passed before, moved then merely by historical curiosity and admiration, but now by emotions for which he found no name. He saw the enormous sarcophagi of granite in their gloomy chambers, where the sacred bulls once lay, swathed and embalmed like human beings, and in the flickering candlelight, the mood of ancient rites surged round him, menacing his doubts and laughter. The least human whisper in these subterraneans, dug out first 4,000 years ago, revived ominous powers that stalked beside him, forbidding and premonitive. He gazed at the spots where Mariette, unearthing them 40 years ago, found fresh as of yesterday the marks of fingers and naked feet, of those who set the 65-ton slabs in position. And when he came up again into the sunshine, he met the eternal questions of the pyramids, overtopping all his mental horizons. Sand blocked all the avenues of younger emotion, leaving the channels of something in him incalculably older, open and clean-swept. He slipped homewards, uncomfortable, and followed, glad to be with a crowd, because he was otherwise alone with more than he could dare to think about. Keeping just ahead of his companions, he crossed the desert edge where the ghost of Memphis walked under rustling palm trees that screened no stone left upon another of all its mile-long populous splendors. For here was a vista his imagination could realize. Here he could know the comfort of solid ground his feet could touch. Gigantic Ramses, lying on his back beneath their shade and staring at the sky, similarly helped to steady his swaying thoughts. Imagination could deal with these. And daily thus he watched the busy world go to and fro to its scale of tips and bargaining, and gladly mingled with it, trying to laugh and study guidebooks and listen to half-fledged explanations, but always seeing the comedy of his poor attempts. Not all those little donkeys, bells tinkling, beads shining, trotting beneath their comical burdens to the tune of shouting and belaboring, could stem this tide of deeper things the woman had let loose in the subconscious part of him. Everywhere he saw the mysterious camels go slouching through the sand, gurgling the water in their skinny extended throats. Centuries passed between the enormous knee-stroke of their stride, and every night the sunsets restored the forbidding graver mood, with their crimson golden splendor, their strange green shafts of light, then,
sudden twilight that brought the past upon him with an awful leap. Upon the stage then stepped the figures of this pair of human beings, chanting their ancient plain song of incantation in the moonlit desert, and working their rites of unholy evocation as the priests had worked them centuries before in the sands that now buried Saqqara fathoms deep. Then one morning he woke with a question in his mind, as though it had been asked of him in sleep and he had waked just before the answer came. Why do I spend my time sightseeing, instead of going alone into the desert as before? What has made me change? This latest mood now asked for explanation, and the answer, coming up automatically, startled him. It was so clear and sure, had been lying in the background all along. One word contained it. Vance. The sinister intentions of this man, forgotten in the rush of other emotions, asserted themselves again convincingly. The human horror, so easily comprehensible, had been smothered for the time by the hint of unearthly revelations. But it had operated all the time. Now it took the lead. He dreaded to be alone in the desert with this dark picture in his mind of what Vance meant to bring there to completion. This abomination of a selfish human will returned to fix its terror in him. To be alone in the desert meant to be alone with the imaginative picture of what Vance, he knew it was such strange certainty, hoped to bring about there. There was absolutely no evidence to justify the grim suspicion. It seemed indeed far-fetched enough, this connection between the sand and the purpose of an evil-minded, violent man, but Henriette saw it true. He could argue it away in a few minutes, easily, yet the instant thought ceased. It returned, led up by intuition. It possessed him, filled his mind with horrible possibilities. He feared the desert as he might have feared the scene of some atrocious crime, and for the first time this dread of a merely human thing corrected the big seduction of the other, the suggested supernatural. Side by side with it, his desire to join himself to the purposes of the woman increased steadily. They kept out of his way, apparently. The other seemed withdrawn. He grew restless, unable to settle to anything for long, and once he asked the porter casually if they were leaving the hotel. Lady Statham had been invisible for days, and Vance was somehow never within speaking distance. He heard with relief that they had not gone, but with dread as well. Keen excitement worked in him underground. He slept badly. Like a schoolboy, he waited for the summons to an important examination that involved portentous issues, and contradictory emotions disturbed his peace of mind abominably. 8. But it was not until the end of the week, when Vance approached him with purpose in his eyes and manner, that Henriette knew his fears unfounded, and caught himself trembling with sudden anticipation, because the invitation, so desired yet so dreaded, was actually at hand. Firmly determined to keep caution uppermost, yet he went unresistingly to a secluded corner by the palms where they could talk in privacy, for prudence is of the mind, but desire is of the soul, and while his brain of today whispered wariness, voices in his heart of long ago shouted commands that he knew he must obey with joy. It was evening and the stars were out. Helouan, with her fairy twinkling lights, lay silent against the desert edge. The sand was at the flood. The period of the encroaching of the desert was at hand, and the deeps were all astir with movement. But in the windless air was a great peace. A calm of infinite stillness breathed everywhere. The flow of time, before it rushed away backwards, stopped somewhere between the dust of stars and desert. The mystery of sand touched every street with its unutterable softness. And Vance began without the smallest circumlocution. His voice was low, in keeping with the scene, but the words dropped with a sharp distinctness into the other's heart like grains of sand that pricked the skin before they smothered him. Caution they smothered instantly. Resistance, too.
"I have a message for you from my aunt,"
he said, as though he brought an invitation to a picnic. Henriette sat in shadow, but his companion's face was in a patch of light that followed them from the windows of the central hall. There was a shining in the light blue eyes that betrayed the excitement his quiet manner concealed.
"We are going, the day after tomorrow, to spend the night in the desert. She wondered if perhaps you would care to join us."
"For your experiment?" asked Henriette bluntly. Vance smiled with his lips, holding his eyes steady, though unable to suppress the gleam that flashed in them and was gone so swiftly. There was a hint of shrugging in his shoulders.
"It is the night of power, in the old Egyptian calendar, you know,"
he answered, with assumed lightness almost. "The final moment of Layl el Sud, the period of black nights, when the desert was held to encroach with various possibilities of a certain supernatural order. She wished to revive a certain practice of the old Egyptians. There may be curious results. At any rate, the occasion is a picturesque one, better than this cheap imitation of London life."
And he indicated the lights, the signs of people in the hall, dressed for gaieties and dances, the hotel orchestra that played after dinner. Henriette at the moment answered nothing, so great was the rush of conflicting emotions that came he knew not whence. Vance went calmly on. He spoke with a simple frankness that was meant to be disarming. Henriette never took his eyes off him. The two men stared steadily at one another.
"She wants to know if we will come and help, too, in a certain way, only. Not in the experiment itself precisely, but by watching merely, and—"
He hesitated an instant, half lowering his eyes. "Drawing the picture?" Henriette helped him deliberately.
"Drawing what you see, yes,"
Vance replied, the voice turned graver in spite of himself.
She hopes to catch the outlines of anything that happens."
"Comes."
"Exactly. Determine the shape of anything that comes. You may remember your conversation of the other night with her. She is very certain of success."
This was direct enough, at any rate. It was as formal as an invitation to a dinner, and as guileless. The thing he thought he wanted lay within his reach. He had merely to say yes. He did say yes, but first he looked about him instinctively, as for guidance. He looked at the stars twinkling high above the distant Libyan plateau, at the long arms of the desert, gleaming weirdly white in the moonlight, and reaching towards him down every opening between the houses, at the heavy mass of the Makatim hills, guarding the Arabian wilderness with strange peaked barriers, their sandy carved ridges dark and still above the Wadi Hof. These questionings attracted no response. The desert watched him, but it did not answer. There was only the shrill whistling cry of the lizards, and the sing-song of a white-robed Arab gliding down the sandy street. And through these sounds he heard his own voice answer. "I will come, yes, but how can I help? Tell me what you propose. Your plan." And the face of Vance, seen plainly in the electric glare, betrayed his satisfaction. The opposing things in the fellow's mind of darkness fought visibly in his eyes and skin. The sordid motive, planning a dreadful act, leaped to his face, and with it a flash of this other yearning that sought unearthly knowledge, perhaps believed it too. No wonder there was conflict written on his features. Then all expression vanished again. He leaned forward, lowering his voice.
"You remember our conversation about there being types of life too vast to manifest in a single body, and my aunt's belief that these were known to certain of the older religious systems of the world?"
"Perfectly."
"Her experiment, then, is to bring one of these great powers back. We possess the sympathetic ritual that can rouse some among them to activity, and win it down into the sphere of our minds heightened, you see, by ceremonial to that stage of clairvoyant vision which can perceive them."
"And then?" They might have been discussing the building of a house, so naturally followed answer upon question. But the whole body of meaning in the old Egyptian symbolism rushed over him with a force that shook his heart. Memory came so marvelously with it.
"If the power floods down into our minds with sufficient strength for actual form to note the outline of such form, and from your drawing model it later in permanent substance, then we should have means of evoking it at will, for we should have its natural body, the form it built itself, its signature, image pattern. A starting point, you see, for more, leading, she hopes, to a complete reconstruction."
"It might take actual shape, assume a bodily form visible to the eye?" repeated Henriette, amazed as before that doubt and laughter did not break through his mind.
"We are on the earth,"
was the reply, spoken unnecessarily low since no living thing was within earshot.
"We are in physical conditions, are we not? Even a human soul we do not recognize unless we see it in a body. Parents provide the outline, the signature, the sigil of the returning soul. This," and he tapped himself upon the breast, "is the physical signature of that type of life we call a soul. Unless there is a life of a certain strength behind it, no body forms. And without a body, we are helpless to control or manage it, deal with it in any way. We could not know it, though being possibly aware of it."
To be aware, you mean, is not sufficient. For he noticed the italics Vance made use of.
"Too vague of no value for future use,"
was the reply.
"But once obtain the form, and we have the natural symbol of that particular power. And a symbol is more than image. It is a direct and concentrated expression of the life it typifies, possibly terrific."
It may be a body, then, this symbol you speak of.
"Accurate vehicle of manifestation, but body seems the simplest word."
Vance answered very slowly and deliberately, although weighing how much he would tell. His language was admirably evasive. Few perhaps would have detected the profound significance the curious words he next used unquestionably concealed. Henriette's mind rejected them, but his heart accepted, for the ancient soul in him was listening and aware.
"Life, using matter to express itself in bodily shape, first traces a geometric pattern, from the lowest form in crystals upwards to more complicated patterns in the higher organizations. There is always first this geometrical pattern, a skeleton, for geometry lies at the root of all possible phenomena, and is the mind's interpretation of a living movement towards shape that shall express it."
He brought his eyes closer to the other, lowering his voice again.
"Hence," he said softly, "the signs in all the old magical systems. Skeleton forms into which the powers evoked descended. Outlines those powers automatically built up when using matter to express themselves. Such signs are material symbols of their bodiless existence. They attract the life they represent and interpret. Obtain the correct true symbol, and the power corresponding to it can approach, once roused and made aware. It has, you see, a ready-made mold into which it can come down."
"Once roused and made aware?" repeated Henriette questioningly, while this man went stammering the letters of a language that he himself had used too long ago to recapture fully.
"Because they've left the world. They sleep unmanifested. Their forms are no longer known to men. No forms exist on earth today that could contain them. But they may be awakened," he added darkly. "They are bound to answer the summons, if such summons can be accurately made."
"Evocation?" whispered Henriette, more distressed than he cared to admit. Vance nodded. Leaning still closer to his companion's face, he thrust his lips forward, speaking eagerly, earnestly, yet somehow at the same time horribly.
"And what we want, my aunt would ask, your draftsman skill, or at any rate your memory afterwards, to establish the outline of anything that comes."
He waited for the answer, still keeping his face uncomfortably close. Henriette drew back a little, but his mind was fully made up now. He had known from the beginning that he would consent, for the desire in him was stronger than all the caution in the world. The past inexorably drew him into the circle of these other lives, and the little human dread Vance woke in him seemed just then insignificant by comparison. It was merely of today. "You two," he said, trying to bring judgment into it, "engaged in evocation, will be in a state of clairvoyant vision. Granted. But shall I, as an outsider observing with unexcited mind, see anything, know anything, be aware of anything at all, let alone the drawing of it?"
"Unless," the reply came instantly with decision, "the descent of power is strong enough to take actual material shape, the experiment is a failure. Anybody can induce objective vision. Such fantasies have no value, though. They are born of an overwrought imagination."
And then he added quickly, as though to clinch the matter before caution and hesitation could take effect,
"You must watch from the heights above. We shall be in the valley. The Wadi Hof is the place. You must not be too close."
"Why not too close?" asked Henriette, springing forward like a flash before he could prevent the sudden impulse. With a quickness equal to his own, Vance answered. There was no faintest sign that he was surprised. His self-control was perfect. Only the glare passed darkly through his eyes and went back again into the somber soul that bore it.
"For your own safety," he answered low. "The power, the type of life she would waken is stupendous, and if roused enough to be attracted by the pattern symbol into which she would decoy it down, it will take actual physical expression. But how? Where is the body of worshippers through whom it can manifest? There is none. It will, therefore, press inanimate matter into the service. The terrific impulse to form itself a means of expression will force all loose matter at hand towards it. Sand, stones, all it can compel to yield. Everything must rush into the sphere of action in which it operates. Alone we at the center, and you upon the outer fringe will be safe. Only you must not come too close."
But Henriette was no longer listening. His soul had turned to ice. For here in this unguarded moment, the cloven hoof had plainly shown itself. In that suggestion of a particular kind of danger, Vance had lifted a corner of the curtain behind which crouched his horrible intention. Vance desired a witness of the extraordinary experiment, but he desired this witness not merely for the purpose of sketching possible shapes that might present themselves to excite vision. He desired a witness for another reason, too. Why had Vance put that idea into his mind? This idea of so peculiar danger. It might well have lost him the very assistance he seemed so anxious to obtain. Henriette could not fathom it quite. Only one thing was clear to him. He, Henriette, was not the only one in danger. They talked for long after that, far into the night. The lights went out, and the armed patrol pacing to and fro outside the iron railings that kept the desert back eyed them curiously. But the only other thing he gathered of importance was the ledge upon the cliff top, where he was to stand and watch. That he was expected to reach there before sunset, and wait till the moon concealed all glimmer in the western sky, and that the woman, who had been engaged for days in secret preparation of soul and body for the awful rite, would not be visible again until he saw her in the depths of the black valley far below, busy with this man upon audacious ancient purposes. 9. An hour before sunset, Henriette put his rugs and food upon a donkey, and gave the boy directions where to meet him, a considerable distance from the appointed spot. He went himself on foot. He slipped in the heat along the sandy street, where strings of camels still go slouching, shuffling with their loads from the quarries that built the pyramids, and he felt that little friendly Heloan tried to keep him back. But the desire now was far too strong for caution. The desert tide was rising. It easily swept him down the long white street towards the enormous deeps beyond. He felt the pull of 1,000 miles before him, and twice 1,000 years drove at his back. Everything still basked in the sunshine. He passed Al Hayat, the stately hotel that dominates the village like a palace built against the sky, and in its pillared colonnades and terraces he saw the throngs of people having late afternoon tea and listening to the music of a regimental band. Men in flannels were playing tennis, parties were climbing off donkeys after long excursions. There was laughter, talking, a babble of many voices. The gaiety called to him. The everyday spirit whispered to stay and join the crowd of lively human beings. Soon there would be merry dinner parties, dancing, voices of pretty women, sweet white dresses, singing, and the rest. Soft eyes would question and turn dark. He picked out several girls he knew among the palms, but it was all many, oh, so many leagues away. Centuries lay between him and this modern world. An indescribable loneliness was in his heart. He went searching through the sands of forgotten ages and wandering among the ruins of a vanished time. He hurried. Already the deeper water caught his breath. He climbed the steep rise towards the plateau where the observatory stands, and saw 2 of the officials whom he knew taking a siesta after their long day's work. He felt that his mind, too, had dived and searched among the heavenly bodies that lived in silent, changeless peace, remote from the world of men. They recognized him. these two whose eyes also knew tremendous distance close. They beckoned, waving the straws through which they sipped their drinks from tall glasses. Their voices floated down to him as from the star fields. He saw the sun gleam upon the glasses, and heard the clink of the ice against the sides. The stillness was amazing. He waved in answer and passed quickly on. He could not stop this sliding current of the years. The tide moved faster, the draw of piled-up cycles urging it. He emerged upon the plateau and met the cooler desert air. His feet went crunching on the desert film that spread its curious dark shiny carpet as far as the eye could reach. It lay everywhere, unswept and smooth as when the feet of vanished civilizations trod its burning surface, then dipped behind the curtains time pins against the stars. And here the body of the tide set all one way. There was a greater strength of current, draft and suction. He felt the powerful undertow. Deeper masses drew his feet sideways, and he felt the rushing of the central body of the sand. The sands were moving, from their foundation upwards. He went unresistingly with them. Turning a moment, he looked back at shining little Helouan in the blaze of evening light. The voices reached him very faintly, merged now in a general murmur. Beyond lay the strip of delta vivid green, the palms, the roofs of Bedrashin, the blue laughter of the Nile with its flocks of curved felucca sails. Further still, rising above the yellow Libyan horizon, gloomed the vast triangles of a dozen pyramids, cutting their wedge-shaped clefts out of a sky fast crimsoning through a sea of gold. Seen thus, their dignity imposed upon the entire landscape. They towered darkly, symbolic signatures of the ancient powers that now watched him taking these little steps across their damaged territory. He gazed a minute, then went on. He saw the big, pale face of the moon in the east. Above the ever-silent thing these giant symbols once interpreted, she rose, grand, effortless, half terrible as themselves. And with her, she lifted up this tide of the desert that drew his feet across the sand to Wadi Hof. A moment later he dipped below the ridge that buried Helouan and Nile and pyramids from sight. He entered the ancient waters. Time then, in an instant, flowed back behind his footsteps, obliterating every trace. And with it his mind went too. He stepped across the gulf of centuries, moving into the past. The desert lay before him, an open tomb wherein his soul should read presently of things long vanished. The strange half-lights of sunset began to play their witchery then upon the landscape. A purple glow came down upon the Makatum hills. Perspective danced its tricks of false incredible deception. The soaring kites that were a mile away seemed suddenly close, passing in a moment from the size of gnats to birds with a fabulous stretch of wing. Ridges and cliffs rushed close without a hint of warning, and level places sank into declivities and basins that made him trip and stumble. That indescribable quality of the desert, which makes timid souls avoid the hour of dusk, emerged. It spread everywhere, undisguised, and the bewilderment it brings is no vain, imagined thing, for it distorts vision utterly, and the effect upon the mind when familiar sight goes floundering is the simplest way in the world of dragging the anchor that grips reality. At the hour of sunset this bewilderment comes upon a man with a disconcerting swiftness. It rose now with all this weird rapidity. Henriette found himself enveloped at a moment's notice, but knowing well its effect, he tried to judge it and pass on. The other matters, the object of his journey chief of all, he refused to dwell upon with any imagination. Wisely, his mind, while never losing sight of it, declined to admit the exaggeration that over-elaborate thinking brings. I'm going to witness an incredible experiment in which two enthusiastic religious dreamers believe firmly, he repeated to himself. I have agreed to draw anything I see. There may be truth in it, or they may be merely self-suggested vision due to an artificial exaltation of their minds. I'm interested, perhaps against my better judgment. Yet I'll see the adventure out, because I must. This was the attitude he told himself to take. Whether it was the real one or merely adopted to warm a cooling courage he could not tell. The emotions were so complex and warring. His mind automatically kept repeating this comforting formula. Deeper than that he could not see to judge. For a man who knew the full content of his thought at such a time would solve some of the oldest psychological problems in the world. Sand had already buried judgment. and with it all attempt to explain the adventure by the standards acceptable to his brain of today. He steered subconsciously through a world of dim, huge, half-remembered wonders. The sun, with that abrupt Egyptian suddenness, was below the horizon now. The pyramid field had swallowed it. Ra, in his golden boat, sailed distant seas beyond the Libyan wilderness. Henriette walked on and on, aware of utter loneliness. He was walking fields of dream, too remote from modern life to recall companionship he once had surely known. How dim it was, how deep and distant, how lost in this sea of an incalculable past. He walked into the places that are soundless. The soundlessness of ocean, miles below the surface, was about him. He was with one only, this unfathomable, silent thing where nothing breathes or stirs, nothing but sunshine, shadow, and the wind-borne sand. Slowly in front, the moon climbed up the eastern sky, hanging above the silence. Silence that ran unbroken across the horizons to where Suez gleamed upon the waters of a sister sea in motion. That moon was glinting now upon the Arabian mountains, by its desolate shores. Southwards stretched the wastes of Upper Egypt, 1,000 miles to meet the Nubian wilderness. But over all these separate deserts stirred the soft whisper of the moving sand, deep murmuring message that life was on the way to unwind death. The Ka of Egypt, swathed in centuries of sand, hovered beneath the moon towards her ancient tenement. For the transformation of the desert now began in earnest. It grew apace. Before he had gone the first 2 miles of his hour's journey, the twilight caught the rocky hills and twisted them into those monstrous revelations of physiognomies they barely take the trouble to conceal even in the daytime. And while he well understood the eroding agencies that have produced them, there yet rose in his mind a deeper interpretation lurking just behind their literal meanings. Here, through the motionless surfaces, that nameless thing the desert ill conceals urged outwards into embryonic form and shape, akin, he almost felt, to those immense, deific symbols of other life the Egyptians knew and worshipped. Hence, from the desert, had first come, he felt, the unearthly life they typified in their monstrous figures of granite, evoked in their stately temples, and communed with in the ritual of their mystery ceremonials. This watching aspect of the Libyan desert is really natural enough, but it is just the natural, Henriette knew, that brings the deepest revelations. The surface limestones, resisting the erosion, block themselves ominously against the sky, while the softer sand beneath sets them on altered pedestals that define their isolation splendidly. Blunt and unconquerable, these masses now watched him pass between them. The desert surface formed them, gave them birth. They rose, they saw, they sank down again. Wave upon a sea that carried forgotten life up from depths below. Of forbidding, even menacing type, they somewhere mated with genuine grandeur. Unformed according to any standard of human or of animal faces, they achieved an air of giant physiognomy which made them terrible. The unwinking stare of eyes, lidless eyes that yet ever succeed in hiding, looked out under well-marked level eyebrows, suggesting a vision that included the motives and purposes of his very heart. They looked up grandly, understood why he was there, and then slowly withdrew their mysterious, penetrating gaze. The strata built them so marvelously up. The heavy, threatening brows, thick lips, curved by the ages into a semblance of cold smiles, jowls drooping into sandy heaps that climbed against the cheeks, protruding jaws and the suggestion of shoulders just about to lift the entire bodies out of the sandy beds. This host of countenances conveyed a solemnity of expression that seemed everlasting, implacable as death. Of human signature they bore no trace, nor was comparison possible between their kind and any animal life. They peopled the desert here, and their smiles, concealed yet just discernible, went broadening with the darkness into a desert laughter. The silence bore it underground, but Henriette was aware of it. The troop of faces slipped into that single enormous countenance which is the visage of the sand, and he saw it everywhere, yet nowhere. Thus with the darkness grew his imaginative interpretation of the desert. Yet there was construction in it, a construction, moreover, that was not entirely his own. Powers he felt were rising, stirring, wakening from sleep. Behind the natural faces that he saw, these other things peered gravely at him as he passed.
They used, as it were, materials that lay ready to their hand. Imagination furnished these hints of outline, yet the powers themselves were real. There was this amazing movement of the sand. By no other manner could his mind have conceived of such a thing, nor dreamed of this simple yet dreadful method of approach. Approach. That was the word that first stood out and startled him. There was approach. Something was drawing nearer. The desert rose and walked beside him. For not alone these ribs of gleaming limestone contributed towards the elemental visages, but the entire hills of which they were an outcrop ran to assist in the formation, and were a necessary part of them. He was watched and stared at from behind, in front, on either side, and even from below. The sand that swept him on kept even pace with him. It turned luminous, too, with a patchwork of glimmering effect that was indescribably weird. Lanterns glowed within its substance, and by their light he stumbled on, glad of the Arab boy he would presently meet at the appointed place. The last torch of the sunset had flickered out, melting into the wilderness, when suddenly, opening at his feet, gaped the deep wide gully known as Wadi Hof. Its curve swept past him. This first impression came upon him with a certain violence, that the desolate valley rushed. He saw but a section of its curve and sweep, but through its entire length of several miles the wadi fled away. The moon whitened it like snow, piling black shadows very close against the cliffs. In the flood of moonlight it went rushing past. It was emptying itself. For a moment the stream of movement seemed to pause and look up into his face, then instantly went on again upon its swift career. It was like the procession of a river to the sea. The valley emptied itself to make way for what was coming. The approach, moreover, had already begun. Conscious that he was trembling, he stood and gazed into the depths, seeking to steady his mind by the repetition of the little formula he had used before. He said it half aloud, but while he did so, his heart whispered quite other things. Thoughts the woman and the man had sown rose up in a flock and fell upon him like a storm of sand. Their impetus drove off all support of ordinary ideas. They shook him where he stood, staring down into this river of strange invisible movement that was hundreds of feet in depth and a quarter of a mile across. He sought to realize himself as he actually was today, mere visitor to Helouan, tempted into this wild adventure with two strangers. But in vain. That seemed a dream, unreal, a transient detail picked out from the enormous past that now engulfed him, heart and mind and soul. This was the reality. The shapes and faces that the hills of sand built round him were the play of excited fancy only. By sheer force he pinned his thought against this fact, but further he could not get. There were powers at work. They were being stirred, wakened somewhere into activity. Evocation had already begun. That sense of their approach as he had walked along from Helouan was not imaginary. A descent of some type of life, vanished from the world too long for recollection, was on the way. So vast that it would manifest itself in a group of forms, a troop, a host, an army. These two were near him somewhere at this very moment, already long at work, their minds driving beyond this little world. The valley was emptying itself, for the descent of life their ritual invited. And the movement in the sand was likewise true. He recalled the sentences the woman had used. My body, he reflected, like the bodies of life makes use of everywhere, is mere upright heap of earth and dust and sand. Here in the desert is the raw material, the greatest store of it in the world. And on the heels of it came sharply that other thing, that this descending life would press into its service all loose matter within its reach, to form that sphere of action which would be in a literal sense its body. In the first few seconds as he stood there, he realized all this, and realized it with an overwhelming conviction it was futile to deny. The fast-emptying valley would later brim with an unaccustomed and terrific life, yet death hid there too, a little ugly, insignificant death. With the name of Vance in it flashed upon his mind and vanished, too tiny to be thought about in this torrent of grander messages that shook the depths within his soul. He bowed his head a moment, hardly knowing what he did. He could have waited thus 1,000 years, it seemed. He was conscious of a wild desire to run away, to hide, to efface himself utterly, his terror, his curiosity, his little wonder,
and not be seen of anything. But it was all vain and foolish. The desert saw him. The gigantic knew that he was there. No escape was possible any longer. Caught by the sand, he stood amid eternal things. The river of movement swept him too. These hills, now motionless as statues, would presently glide forward into the cavalcade, sway like vessels, and go past with the procession. At present, only the contents, not the frame of the wadi, moved. An immense soft brush of moonlight swept it empty for what it was on the way. But presently the entire desert would stand up and also go. Then, making a sideways movement, his feet kicked against something soft and yielding that lay heaped upon the desert floor, and Henriette discovered the rugs the Arab boy had carefully set down before he made full speed for the friendly lights of Helouan. The sound of his departing footsteps had long since died away. He was alone. The detail restored to him his consciousness of the immediate present, and stooping, he gathered up the rugs and overcoat and began to make preparations for the night. But the appointed spot whence he was to watch lay upon the summit of the opposite cliffs. He must cross the wadi bed and climb. Slowly and with labor he made his way down a steep cleft into the depth of the Wadi Hof, sliding and stumbling often till at length he stood upon the floor of shining moonlight. It was very smooth, windless utterly, still as space. Each particle of sand lay in its ancient place asleep. The movement, it seemed, had ceased. He clambered next up the eastern side through pitch-black shadows, and, within the hour, reached the ledge upon the top whence he could see below him, like a silvered map, the sweep of the valley bed. The wind nipped keenly here again, coming over the leagues of cooling sand. Loose boulders of splintered rock, started by his climbing, crashed and boomed into the depths. He banked the rugs behind him, wrapped himself in his overcoat, and lay down to wait. Behind him was a 2-foot crumbling wall against which he leaned. In front, a drop of several hundred feet through space. He lay upon a platform, therefore, invisible from the desert at his back. Below, the curving wadi formed a natural amphitheater in which each separate boulder fallen from the cliffs, and even the little scilla shrubs the camels eat, were plainly visible. He noted all the bigger ones among them. He counted them over half aloud. And then the moving stream he had been unaware of when crossing the bed itself now began again. The wadi went rushing past before the broom of moonlight. Again the enormous and the tiny combined in one single strange impression. For through this conception of great movement stirred also a roving, delicate touch that his imagination felt as bird-like. Behind the solid mass of the desert's immobility flashed something swift and light and airy. Bizarre pictures interpreted it to him, like rapid snapshots of a huge flying panorama. He thought of darting dragonflies seen at Helouan, of children's little dancing feet, of twinkling butterflies, of birds. Chiefly, yes, of a flock of birds in flight, whose separate units formed a single entity. The idea of the group soul possessed his mind once more, but it came with a sense of more than curiosity or wonder. Veneration lay behind it, a veneration touched with awe. It rose in his deepest thought that here was the first hint of a symbolical representation, a symbol, sacred and inviolable, belonging to some ancient worship that he half remembered in his soul, stirred towards interpretation through all his being. He lay there waiting, wondering vaguely where his two companions were, yet fear all vanished because he felt attuned to a scale of things too big to mate with definite dread. There was high anticipation in him, but not anxiety. Of himself as Felix Henriette, indeed, he hardly seemed aware. He was someone else, or rather, he was himself at a stage he had known once far, far away in a remote pre-existence. He watched himself from dim summits of a past, of which no further details were as yet recoverable. Pencil and sketching block lay ready to his hand. The moon rose higher, tucking the shadows ever more closely against the precipices. The silver passed into a sheet of snowy whiteness that made every boulder clearly visible. Solemnity deepened everywhere into awe. The wadi fled silently down the stream of hours. It was almost empty now, and then abruptly he was aware of change. The motion altered somewhere. It moved more quietly. Pace slackened. The end of the procession that evacuated the depth and length of it went trailing past and turned the distant bend. "It's slowing up," he whispered, as sure of it as though he had watched a regiment of soldiers filing by. The wind took off his voice like a flying feather of sound. And there was a change. It had begun. Night and the moon stood still to watch and listen. The wind dropped utterly away. The sand ceased its shifting movement. The desert everywhere stopped still and turned. Some curtain, then, that for centuries had veiled the world, drew softly up, leaving a shaded vista down which the eyes of his soul peered towards long-forgotten pictures. Still buried by the sands too deep for full recovery, he yet perceived dim portions of them, things once honored and loved passionately. For once they had surely been to him the whole of life, not merely a fragment for cheap wonder to inspect. And they were curiously familiar, even as the person of this woman who now evoked them was familiar. Henriette made no pretense to more definite remembrance. But the haunting certainty rushed over him, deeper than doubt or denial, and with such force that he felt no effort to destroy it. Some lost sweetness of spiritual ambitions lived for with this passionate devotion, and passionately worshipped as men today worship fame and money, revived in him with a tempest of high glory. Centers of memory stirred from an age-long sleep, so that he could have wept at their so complete obliteration hitherto. That such majesty had departed from the world, as though it never had existed, was a thought for desolation and for tears. And though the little fragment he was about to witness might be crude in itself and incomplete, yet it was part of a vast system that once explored the richest realms of deity. The reverence in him contained a holiness of the night and of the stars. Great, gentle awe lay in it too, for he stood aflame with anticipation and humility at the gateway of sacred things. And this was the mood, no thrill of cheap excitement or alarm to weaken in which he first became aware that 2 spots of darkness he had taken all along for boulders on the snowy valley bed were actually something very different. They were living figures. They moved. It was not the shadows slowly following the moonlight, but the stir of human beings who all these hours had been motionless as stone. He must have passed them unnoticed within a dozen yards when he crossed the wadi bed, and 100 times from this very ledge his eyes had surely rested on them without recognition. Their minds, he knew full well, had not been inactive as their bodies. The important part of the ancient ritual lay, he remembered, in the powers of the evoking mind. Here indeed was no effective nor theatrical approach of the principal figures. It had nothing in common with the cheap external ceremonial of modern days. In forgotten powers of the soul its grandeur lay potent, splendid, true. Long before he came, perhaps all through the day, these two had labored with their arduous preparations. They were there, part of the desert, when hours ago he had crossed the plateau in the twilight. To them, to this woman's potent working of old ceremonial, had been due that singular rush of imagination he had felt. He had interpreted the desert as alive. Here was the explanation. It was alive. Life was on the way. Long latent, her intense desire summoned it back to physical expression. And the effect upon him had steadily increased as he drew nearer to the center where she would focus its revival and return. Those singular impressions of being watched and accompanied were explained. A priest of this old-world worship performed a genuine evocation. A great one of vision revived the cosmic powers. Henriette watched the small figures far below him with a sense of dramatic splendor that only this association of far-off memory could account for. It was their rising now, and the lift of their arms to form a slow revolving outline that marked the abrupt cessation of the larger river of movement. For the sweep of the wadi sank into sudden stillness, and these two, with motions not unlike some dance of deliberate solemnity, passed slowly through the moonlight to and fro. His attention fixed upon them both. All other movement ceased. They fastened the flow of time against the desert's body. What happened then? How could his mind interpret an experience so long denied that the power of expression, as of comprehension, had ceased to exist? How translate this symbolical representation, small detail though it was, of a transcendent worship, entombed for most so utterly beyond recovery? Its splendor could never lodge in minds that conceived deity perched upon a cloud within telephoning distance of fashionable churches. How should he phrase it even to himself, whose memory drew up pictures from so dim a past that the language fit to frame them lay unreachable and lost? Henriette did not know. Perhaps he never yet has known. Certainly at the time he did not even try to think. His sensations remain his own, untranslatable. And even that instinctive description the mind gropes for automatically floundered, halted, and stopped dead. Yet there rose within him somewhere, from depths long drowned in slumber, a reviving power by which he saw, divined, and recollected. Remembered seemed too literal a word. These elements of a worship he once had personally known. He too had worshipped thus. His soul had moved amid similar evocations in some aeonian past, whence now the sand was being cleared away. Symbols of stupendous meaning flashed and went their way across the lifting mists. He hardly caught their meaning, so long it was since he had known them. Yet they were familiar as the faces seen in dreams, and some hint of their spiritual significance left faint traces in his heart by means of which their grandeur reached towards interpretation. And all were symbols of a cosmic deific nature, of powers that only symbols can express, prayer books and sacraments used in the wisdom religion of an older time, but today known only in the decrepit literal shell which is their degradation. Grandly the figures moved across the valley bed. The powers of the heavenly bodies once more joined them. They moved to the measure of a cosmic dance whose rhythm was creative. The universe partnered them. There was this transfiguration of all common external things. He realized that appearances were visible letters of soundless language, a language he once had known. The powers of night and moon and desert, sand, married with points in the fluid stream of his inmost spiritual being that knew and welcomed them. He understood. Old Egypt herself stooped down from her uncovered throne. The stars sent messengers. There was commotion in the secret, sandy places of the desert. For the desert had grown temple. Columns reared against the sky. There rose from leagues away the chanting of the sand. The temples, where once this came to pass, were gone, their ruin questioned by alien hearts that knew not their spiritual meaning. But here the entire desert swept in to form a shrine, and the majesty that once was Egypt stepped grandly back across the ages of denial and neglect. The sand was altar, and the stars were altar lights. The moon lit up the vast recesses of the ceiling, and the winds from 1,000 miles brought in the perfume of her incense. For with that faith which shifts mountains from their sandy bed, two passionate, believing souls invoked the Ka of Egypt. And the motions that they made, he saw, were definite harmonious patterns, their dark figures traced upon the shining valley floor. Like the points of compasses with stems invisible, and directed from the sky, their movements marked the outlines of great signatures of power, the sigils of the type of life they would evoke. It would come as a procession. No individual outline could contain it. It needed for its visible expression many. The descent of a group soul, known to the worship of this mighty system, rose from its lair of centuries and moved hugely down upon them. The Ka, answering to the summons, would mate with sand. The desert was its body. Yet it was not this that he had come to fix with block and pencil. Not yet was the moment when his skill might be of use. He waited, watched, and listened while this river of half-remembered things went past him. The patterns grew beneath his eyes like music. Too intricate and prolonged to remember with accuracy later, he understood that they were forms of that root geometry which lies behind all manifested life. The mold was being traced in outline. Life would presently inform it. And a singing rose from the maze of lines whose beauty was like the beauty of the constellations. The sound was very faint at first, but grew steadily in volume. Although no echoes, properly speaking, were possible, these precipices caught stray notes that trooped in from the further sandy reaches. The figures certainly were chanting, but their chanting was not all he heard. Other sounds came to his ears from far away, running past him through the air from every side, and from incredible distances, all flocking down into the wadi bed to join the parent note that summoned them. The desert was giving voice. And memory, lifting her hood yet higher, showed more of her gray, mysterious face that searched his soul with questions. Had he so soon forgotten that strange union of form and sound which once was known to the evocative rituals of olden days? Henriette tried patiently to disentangle this desert music that their intoning voices woke from the humming of the blood in his own veins, but he succeeded only in part. Sand was already in the air. There was reverberation, rhythm, measure. There was almost the breaking of the stream into great syllables,
But was it due, this strange reverberation, to the countless particles of sand meeting in mid-air about him, or to larger bodies, whose surfaces caught this friction of the sand and threw it back against his ears? The wind, now rising, brought particles that stung his face and hands, and filled his eyes with a minute fine dust that partially veiled the moonlight. But was not something larger, vaster, these particles composed now also on the way? Movement and sound and flying sand thus merged themselves more and more into a single whirling torrent. But Henriette sought no commonplace explanation of what he witnessed. And here was the proof that all happened in some vestibule of inner experience, where the strain of question and answer had no business. One sitting beside him need not have seen anything at all. His host, for instance, from Helouan, need not have been aware. Night screened it. Helouan, as the whole of modern experience, stood in front of the screen. This thing took place behind it. He crouched motionless, watching in some reconstructed antechamber of the soul's pre-existence, while the torrent grew into a veritable tempest. Yet night remained unshaken. The veil of moonlight did not quiver. The stars dropped their slender golden pillars unobstructed. Calmness reigned everywhere as before. The stupendous representation passed on behind it all. But the dignity of the little human movements that he watched had become now indescribable. The gesture of the arms and bodies invested themselves with consummate grandeur, as these two strode into the caverns behind manifested life and drew forth symbols that represented vanished powers. The sound of their chanting voices broke in cadenced fragments against the shores of language. The words Henriette never actually caught, if words they were, yet he understood their purport, these names of power to which the type of returning life gave answer as they approached. He remembered fumbling for his drawing materials with such violence, however, that the pencil snapped in two between his fingers as he touched it. For now, even here, upon the outer fringe of the ceremonial ground, there was a stir of forces that set the very muscles working in him before he had become aware of it. Then came the movement when his heart leaped against his ribs with a sudden violence that was almost pain, standing a second later still as death. The lines upon the valley floor ceased their maze-like dance. All movement stopped. Sound died away. In the midst of this profound and dreadful silence, the sigils lay empty there below him. They waited to be informed. For the moment of entrance had come at last. Life was close. And he understood why this return of life had all along suggested a procession and could be no mere momentary flash of vision. From such appalling distance did it sweep down towards the present. Upon this network, then, of splendid lines at length held rigid, the entire desert reared itself, with walls of curtained sand that dwarfed the cliffs, the shouldering hills, the very sky. The desert stood on end. As once before he had dreamed it from his balcony windows, it rose upright, towering and close against his face. It built sudden ramparts to the stars that chambered the thing he witnessed behind walls no centuries could ever bring down crumbling into dust. He himself, in some curious fashion, lay just outside, viewing it apart. As from a pinnacle, he peered within, peered down with straining eyes into the vast picture gallery memory threw abruptly open. And the picture spaced its noble outline thus against the very stars. He gazed between columns that supported the sky itself, like pillars of sand that swept across the field of vanished years. Sand poured and streamed aside, laying bare the past. For down the enormous vista into which he gazed, as into an avenue running 1,000,000 miles towards a tiny point, he saw this moving thing that came towards him, shaking loose the countless veils of sand the ages had swathed about it. The Ka of buried Egypt wakened out of sleep. She had heard the potent summons of her old time-honored ritual. She came. She stretched forth an arm towards the worshippers who evoked her. Out of the desert, out of the leagues of sand, out of the immeasurable wilderness, which was her mummified form and body, she rose and came. And this fragment of her he would actually see, this little portion that was obedient to the stammered and broken ceremonial. The partial revelation he would witness, yet so vast, even this little bit of it, that it came as a procession and a host. For a moment there was nothing, and then the voice of the woman rose in a resounding cry that filled the wadi to its furthest precipices before it died away again to silence. That a human voice could produce such volume, accent, depth, seemed half incredible. The walls of towering sand swallowed it instantly.
But the procession of life, needing a group, a host, an army for its physical expression, reached at that moment the nearer end of the huge avenue. It touched the present. It entered the world of men. 10. The entire range of Henriette's experience, read, imagined, dreamed, then fainted into unreality before the sheer wonder of what he saw. In the brief interval it takes to snap the fingers, the climax was thus so hurriedly upon him. And through it all he was clearly aware of the pair of little human figures, man and woman, standing erect and commanding at the center. Knew, too, that she directed and controlled, while he in some secondary fashion supported her, and ever watched. But both were dim, dropped somewhere into a lesser scale. It was the knowledge of their presence, however, that alone enabled him to keep his powers in hand at all. But for these two human beings, there within possible reach, he must have closed his eyes and swooned. For a tempest that seemed to toss loose stars about the sky swept round about him, pouring up the pillared avenue in front of the procession. A blast of giant energy, of liberty, came through. Forwards and backwards, circling spirally about him like a whirlwind, came this revival of life that sought to dip itself once more in matter and in form. It came to the accurate outline of its form they had traced for it. He held his mind steady enough to realize that it was akin to what men called a descent of some spiritual movement that wakens a body of believers into faith, a race, an entire nation. Only that he experienced it in this brief concentrated form before it has scattered down into 10,000 hearts. Here he knew its source and essence behind the veil. Crudely, unmanageable as yet, he felt it, rushing loose behind appearances. There was this amazing impact of a twisting, swinging force that stormed down as though it would bend and coil the very ribs of the old, stubborn hills. It sought to warm them with the stress of its own irresistible life stream, to beat them into shape, and make pliable their obstinate resistance. Through all the things the impulse poured and spread, like fire at white heat. Yet nothing visible came as yet, no alteration in the actual landscape, no sign of change in things familiar to his eyes, while impetus thus fought against inertia. He perceived nothing formal. Calm and untouched himself, he lay outside the circle of evocation, watching, waiting, scarcely daring to breathe, yet well aware that any minute the scene would transfer itself from memory that was subjective to matter that was objective. And then, in a flash, the bridge was built, and the transfer was accomplished. How or where he did not see, he could not tell. It was there before he knew it, there before his normal earthly sight. He saw it, as he saw the hands he was holding stupidly up to shield his face. For this terrific release of force long held back, long stored up, latent for centuries, came pouring down the empty wadi bed prepared for its reception. Through stones and sand and boulders it came in an impetuous hurricane of power. The liberation of its life appalled him. All that was free, untied, responded instantly like chaff. Loose objects fled towards it. There was a yielding in the hills and precipices, and even in the mass of desert which provided their foundation. The hinges of the sand went creaking into the night. It shaped for itself a bodily outline. Yet most strangely, nothing definitely moved. How could he express the violent contradiction? For the immobility was apparent only, a sham, a counterfeit, while behind it the essential being of these things did rush and shift and alter. He saw the two things side by side, the outer immobility the senses commonly agree upon, and this amazing flying out of their inner invisible substance towards the vertex of attracting life that sucked them in. For stubborn matter turned docile before the stress of this returning life, taught somewhere to be plastic. It was being molded into an approach to bodily outline. A mobile elasticity invaded rigid substance. The two officiating human beings, safe at the stationary center, and himself, just outside the circle of operation, alone remained untouched and unaffected. But a few feet in any direction for any one of them meant instantaneous death. They would be absorbed into the vortex, mere corpuscles pressed into the service of this sphere of action of a mighty body. How these perceptions reached him with such conviction, Henriette could never say. He knew it because he felt it. Something fell about him from the sky that already paled towards the dawn.
The stars themselves, it seemed, contributed some part of the terrific flowing impulse that conquered matter and shaped itself this physical expression. Then, before he was able to fashion any preconceived idea of what visible form this potent life might assume, he was aware of further change. It came at the briefest possible interval after the beginning. This, certainly, that to and fro about him, as yet, however, indeterminate, passed magnitudes that were stupendous as the desert. There was beauty in them, too, though a terrible beauty hardly of this earth at all. A fragment of old Egypt had returned, a little portion of that vast body of belief that once was Egypt. Evoked by the worship of one human heart, passionately sincere, the Ka of Egypt stepped back to visit the material it once informed, the sand. Yet only a portion came. Henry had clearly realized that. It stretched forth an arm, finding no mass of worshippers through whom it might express itself completely. It pressed inanimate matter thus into its service. Here was the beginning the woman had spoken of. Little opening clue. Entire reconstruction lay perhaps beyond. And Henriette next realized that these magnitudes in which this group energy sought to clothe itself as visible form were curiously familiar. It was not a new thing that he would see. Booming softly as they dropped downwards through the sky with a motion the size of them rendered delusive, they trooped up the avenue towards the central point that summoned them. He realized the giant flock of them, descent of fearful beauty, outlining a type of life denied to the world for ages, countless as the sand that blew against his skin. Careering over the waste of desert moved the army of dark splendors that dwarfed any organic structure called a body men have ever known. He recognized them, cold in him of death, though the outlines reared higher than the pyramids and towered up to hide whole groups of stars. Yes, he recognized them in their partial revelation, though he never saw the monstrous host complete. But one of them, he realized, posing its eternal riddle to the sands, had of old been glimpsed sufficiently to seize its form in stone, yet poorly seized, as a doll may stand for the dignity of a human being, or a child's toy represent an engine that draws trains. And he knelt there on his narrow ledge, the world of men forgotten. The power that caught him was too great a thing for wonder, or for fear. He even felt no awe. Sensation of any kind that can be named or realized left him utterly. He forgot himself. He merely watched. The glory numbed him. Block and pencil as the reason of his presence there at all no longer existed. Yet one small link remained that held him to some kind of consciousness of earthly things. He never lost sight of this. That, being just outside the circle of evocation, he was safe, and that the man and woman, being stationary in its untouched center, were also safe. But that a movement of 6 inches in any direction meant for any one of them instant death. What was it, then, that suddenly strengthened this solitary link so that the chain tautened and he felt the pull of it? Henriette could not say. He came back with the rush of a descending drop to the realization, dimly, vaguely, as from great distance, that he was with these two now at this moment in the Wadi Hof, and that the cold of dawn was in the air about him. The chill breath of the desert made him shiver. But, at first, so deeply had his soul been dipped in this fragment of ancient worship, he could remember nothing more. Somewhere lay a little spot of streets and houses. Its name escaped him. He had once been there. There were many people, but insignificant people. Who were they? And what had he to do with them? All recent memories had been drowned in the tide that flooded him from an immeasurable past. And who were they, these two beings standing on the white floor of sand below him? For a long time he could not recover their names. Yet he remembered them, and thus robbed of association that names bring, he saw them for an instant naked, and knew that one of them was evil. One of them was vile. Blackness touched the picture there. The man, his name still out of reach, was sinister, impure and dark at the heart. And for this reason the evocation had been partial only. The admixture of an evil motive was the flaw that marred complete success. The names then flashed upon him. Lady Statham, Richard Vance. Vance. With a horrible drop from splendor into something mean and sordid, Henriette felt the pain of it. The motive of the man was so insignificant, his purpose so atrocious. More and more, with the name, came back his first repugnance, fear, suspicion. And human terror caught him. He shrieked. But as in nightmare, no sound escaped his lips. He tried to move, a wild desire to interfere, to protect, to prevent, flung himself forward, close to the dizzy edge of the gulf below. But his muscles refused obedience to the will. The paralysis of common fear rooted him to the rocks. But the sudden change of focus instantly destroyed the picture. And so vehement was the fall from glory into meanness that it dislocated the machinery of clairvoyant vision. The inner perception clouded and grew dark. Outer and inner mingled in violent, inextricable confusion. The wrench seemed almost physical. It happened all at once. Retreat and continuation for a moment, somehow combined. And if he did not definitely see the awful thing, at least he was aware that it had come to pass. He knew it as positively as though his eye were glued against a magnifying lens in the stillness of some laboratory. He witnessed it. The supreme moment of evocation was close. Life, through that awful sandy vortex, whirled and raged. Loose particles showered and pelted, caught by the draft of vehement life that molded the substance of the desert into imperial outline, when suddenly shot the little evil thing across that mard and blasted it. Into the whirlpool flew forward a particle of material that was a human being, and the group soul caught and used it. The actual accomplishment Henriette did not claim to see. He was a witness, but a witness who could give no evidence. Whether the woman was pushed of set intention, or whether some detail of sound and pattern was falsely used to effect the terrible result, he was helpless to determine. He pretends no itemized account. She went. In 1 second, with appalling swiftness, she disappeared, swallowed out of space and time within that awful maw. One little corpuscle among a million through which the life, now stalking the desert wastes, molded itself a troop-like body. Sand took her. There followed emptiness, a hush of unutterable silence, stillness, peace. Movement and sound instantly retired whence they came. The avenues of memory closed. The splendors all went down into their sandy tombs. The moon had sunk into the Libyan wilderness. The eastern sky was red. The dawn drew out that wondrous sweetness of the desert, which is as sister to the sweetness that the moonlight brings. The desert settled back to sleep, huge, unfathomable, charged to the brim with life that watches, waits, and yet conceals itself behind the ruins of apparent desolation. And the wadi, empty at his feet, filled slowly with the gentle little winds that bring the sunrise. Then, across the pale glimmering of sand, Henriette saw a figure moving. It came quickly towards him, yet unsteadily, and with a hurry that was ugly. Vance was on the way to fetch him, and the horror of the man's approach struck him like a hammer in the face. He closed his eyes, sinking back to hide. But, before he swooned, there reached him the clatter of the murderer's tread as he began to climb over the splintered rocks, and the faint echo of his voice, calling him by name, falsely and in pretense for help.